the satisfying downfall of every major dictator. When you talk about some of the most evil dictators in all of modern history, most people reasonably focus on their crimes against humanity. However, people typically forget to mention exactly how these people were brought to justice or how they got away with it. And in this video, we're going to discuss exactly how every major dictator lost either their power or, in most cases, their life. Let's begin. Kim Jong-il. In 1994, Kim Jong-il became the ruler of North Korea when his father passed away. And what Kim Jong-il inherited from his father was a communist nation that was run with an iron fist, completely isolated from any outside sources, repressive in almost every sense of the word, and riddled with human rights violations. And Kim Jong-il gladly took this country and continued the tradition. And like any wild dictator, of course, he gave himself a crazy title. In this case, Kim Jong-il was the supreme leader of North Korea. Due to how secretive North Korea is, there's actually not much known about Kim Jong-il's early life, although it's speculated that he was born in 1941 on a Soviet military base near the Russia-North Korean border because that's where his father was stationed at the time. However, when Kim Jong-il became the supreme leader of North Korea, a lot of interesting facts were presented by the North Korean government about their new leader's past. Specifically, that he was born on February 16th, 1942 on top of North Korea's sacred Mount Pictu. But not only that he was born on top of this mountain, but when he was born, a new star appeared in the sky and a double rainbow appeared overhead. That claim alone is crazy, and keep in mind, this isn't hyperbole or metaphorical. They present this information as fact, and the North Korean citizens are meant to believe it. And even if they don't believe it, they better act like they believe it. But besides the crazy claims about his birth, there's also an endless supply of crazy claims around his achievements in his life. One of my favorites being that he made 11 holes in one in a single round of golf. Another being that he composed operas popular in China, and also that he invented an invisible cell phone and that he could literally control the weather. I feel bad for the North Korean citizens that blindly fell for all of this obvious propaganda, but I almost feel worse for those who saw through the propaganda and had to believe in a world that they knew was fake and there was nothing they could do about it. At least if you believed it, you were blissfully ignorant to the truth. Regardless, after Kim Jong-il grew to power, only a few years after Kim Jong-il was given power of all of North Korea, he was responsible for a series of famines that killed an estimated 2 million people from 1994 until 2000. And that is really only the beginning of the human rights violations that happened in North Korea during his supreme rule. But things started to change in the late 2000s, when Kim Jong-il was not seen in public places, specifically in the 2008 Olympics or in military demonstrations where he was always attending. Other countries started to suspect that Kim Jong-il was beginning to be in poor health or potentially even already dead, although the North Korean state media made it seem like everything was just fine and dandy. That was until December 17th, 2011, when Kim Jong-il was confirmed dead by the North Korean government. The North Korean government claimed that he died of overexertion because he was simply working so hard, making North Korea the best it could be for the people. But in reality, he likely just passed away from a heart attack. And following his death, there was a mandatory 11-day mourning period where everybody had to publicly look upset about the death. And Kim Jong-il's body was even placed on public display in a memorial palace in Pyongyang. This is the same palace where his father's body is also on permanent display. Following his death, his youngest son, Kim Jong-un, was given total control of this dictatorial regime. And as of today, he's still in power. But maybe in a future video, we can discuss his downfall as well. Hideki Tojo. Hideki was born and raised deep within the grips of imperialistic Japan. He was born in 1884 and began his education at the Imperial Japanese Army Academy, and then began his career in the Imperial Japanese Army in 1905. After spending time in the Japanese Army, he served as the military attaché in Germany, of all places, from 1919 until 1922. And from that point, over the next 15 to 20 years, he began quickly rising through the ranks of the Japanese military and Japanese government until October of 1941, when he was appointed the Prime Minister of Japan. Now, under a different context, that may seem like an impressive military and political career. However, the actions that took place under this man's rule is anything but impressive, and is truly nothing short of a nightmare. Hideki was the Prime Minister of Japan from 1941 until 1944 when, well, we'll get to that. And if you couldn't already tell, that was during the Second World War. And if you know anything about World War II in Japan, well, they weren't up to much good stuff. And some of the things attributed to Hideki's rule are the following: numerous war crimes, including the massacre and starvation of thousands of of prisoners of war and millions of innocent civilians, the attack that happened on Pearl Harbor, which literally happened 2 months after he was appointed prime minister, and other numerous mass murders that happened in and out of Japan during his rule. And not to mention, before he was even prime minister but still an extremely highly ranking military official, the whole Japanese invasion of China in 1937 happened, and that's a completely different can of worms, but just know that that was literally hell on earth as well. It's safe to say that a genocidal military appointed prime minister is really nothing short of a dictator. And even if you don't specifically classify him as a dictator, well, his resume doesn't make him any better than one. And on July 18th of 1944, Hideki actually resigned as prime minister, as the war was definitely not going Japan's way. After he resigned, Japan surrendered to the Allied powers, and in September of 1945, Hideki was arrested. Following his arrest, he was put on trials in an international tribunal military court, where he was sentenced to death for numerous crimes against humanity and numerous war crimes. And on December 23rd, 1948, only 2 days before Christmas, Hideki was hung. And his reign of terror was over, but definitely not forgotten. Pol Pot. In the 1960s, in the Cambodian jungle, Pol Pot began to organize the Khmer Rouge, a group that advocated for a radical communist revolution to essentially wipe out any form of Western influence in Cambodia. In 1970, Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge troops, along with North Vietnamese troops, began a large-scale insurgency against the Cambodian government. And through this insurgency, they were able to control a third of the entire country. And by April of 1975, only 5 years later, Khmer Rouge was able to capture the capital of Cambodia, overthrow the pro-US regime, and establish a new government, the Kampuchean People's Republic. Once Pol Pot was fully in power of Cambodia, the cities were evacuated, schools and factories were closed, and any form of private property or currency was abolished. And terrifyingly, anybody who is believed to be intellectual, such as somebody who was proficient in math or potentially spoke a foreign language, was immediately killed. Even if you were good at your job, just a skilled worker, you were also killed. But even if you weren't speaking other languages or particularly good at your job, if you even had any form of basic technology, such as glasses, a watch, or even maybe a little radio, you were once again killed. And because of this, from 1975 to 1978, it's estimated that over 2 million Cambodian people were killed by either execution or forced labor or famine. But in 1978 to 1979, Vietnamese troops were back in Cambodia, but this time to overthrow the Khmer Rouge because they saw how crazy things have gotten. And in 1979, Pol Pot and the remaining Khmer Rouge members retreated back into the Cambodian jungle. In 1985, Pol Pot officially retired from being the head of the Khmer Rouge, even though it was already at this point no longer controlling Cambodia and more or less of a entity that just existed in Cambodia. But even still, after his retirement, the Khmer Rouge still continued to take out guerrilla actions against the Cambodian government. But in 1997, Pol Pot was finally put on trial, and he was sentenced not to death, but to life in prison. And if you're not already upset, this is where things get really upsetting. Because although so many people wanted him to be extradited and sentenced to death, he not only just got life in prison, but he was also able to serve time in his home on house arrest. And a year after his trial in 1998, Pol Pot declared in an interview that, quote, "My conscience is clear." And later that year, he died in his home peacefully in his sleep. Life is truly unfair. Some of the best people in the world are gone too soon in horrific ways. And others who kill millions of their own people get to live long lives and die peacefully in their sleep. Sometimes you just feel like justice truly wasn't served. Benito Mussolini. World War II is going to be a common theme in this video because unfortunately there was an abundance of dictators, but I'm going to sprinkle them throughout so it's not all at once. Early in Mussolini's career, he was a socialist politician and a journalist at a newspaper. And in 1912, he became a member of the National Directorate of the Italian Socialist Party, but was actually kicked out of that because he wanted military intervention in World War I. Because of this, in 1914, Mussolini founded his own newspaper and also served in the Royal Italian Army until he was wounded and discharged in 1917. After being removed from both political and military groups, he decided that the best next course of action was to start his own thing. And what he started was a fascist movement in Italy. In 1922, following the March on Rome, he was appointed as the prime minister by King Victor Emmanuel III. And shortly after becoming the non-elected prime minister of a country, Mussolini, through the help of his secret police and his followers, were able to consolidate all of their power, transforming Italy into a one-party dictatorship. Within 5 years of being the appointed prime minister, Mussolini was able to establish a dictatorial authority by both illegal and legal means. And his goal was to create a totalitarian state. And if you're unfamiliar, totalitarianism is essentially just a political system that literally prohibits the opposition of the government, meaning that the government controls and owns everything and you cannot say anything about it. From his rise to power in 1922 to 1937, there was multiple wars and conflicts that Italy was involved in due to their new political structure. And in 1937, after the huge costs of all of the conflicts that they were involved in, they decided to preemptively join the Axis powers, specifically Germany and Japan. And this ended up being extremely helpful for Italy because they were completely unprepared for World War War II. In July of 1943, when the Allied powers invaded Sicily, King Victor Emmanuel III, the person who initially appointed Mussolini, was now dethroning Mussolini, and didn't only take his power, but also put him in custody. But it didn't last long, as Germany was able to successfully rescue Mussolini, and Mustache Man from Germany made Mussolini a ruler of a not-so-official puppet state that was just a German-occupied part of northern Italy, which was known as the Italian Social Republic. But when Germany and Italy and the Axis powers began to fall, and it was obvious that the Axis powers were no longer going to win World War II, Mussolini and his mistress at the time attempted to fully flee Italy and go to Switzerland to essentially go into hiding. While en route to Switzerland, the pair stopped near Lake Como with a group of other fascists and German soldiers, basically right on the border of Switzerland. During this brief break on their escape, Mussolini was actually trying to be incognito, and how he did so was by dressing up as a German soldier, which you know you're a bad guy if you're disguised as a German soldier. But even with this disguise, it didn't help him, because Italian partisans saw him and killed him and his girlfriend essentially on sight. They recognized him, and at that point, Mussolini no longer existed. Nicolae Ceausescu. Born in 1918, Nicolae was born to be a politician. As a child, he was a member of the Romanian Communist Youth Movement, and as a young adult, he found himself rising through the ranks of the Romanian Communist Party. And when the previous leader of that communist government died in 1965, Nicolae was handed the torch, and he became the Romanian Communist Party General Secretary. And from being declared General Secretary in 1965, he was able to gain power, and in 1974, only 9 years later, declare himself as the Romanian president, which essentially gave him total control of the entire country of Romania. When somebody grants themselves total control of an entire country, it's not hard to believe that they would start easing in things like censorship of the press and totalitarian rule, something we discussed earlier. And it got so bad that at the time it was considered one of the most repressive governments in all of Europe. Nicolae had secret police that were responsible for mass surveillance and even mass repression of human rights abuses that were happening in the country. And because of his censorship of the press, a lot of the things that were going on within the country were not able to be spread within or outside of the country either. There was a time when Nicolae was actually popular, although his popularity was extremely brief and unstable. And during the late 1970s, while he was the president, his mismanagement led to massive debts for the country of Romania. And in 1982, Nicolae forced the Romanian government to export way too much of the country's agricultural resources in order to help pay these debts, which obviously put pressure on the citizens of Romania. Fast forward to 1989, only 7 years later, anti-government protesters are popping up all over the place. And Nicolae saw these demonstrations as a political threat and ordered the military to open fire on these demonstrators, resulting in multiple deaths and injuries. And because of this action, the people could no longer take it, and massive, widespread rioting and civil unrest roared across the entire country of Romania and sparked the Romanian Revolution. It got to the point where demonstrators were breaking into the Capitol building of Romania, and Nicolae and his wife fled from the roof of the building on a helicopter, although the military forced them to land, and they were arrested, tried, and convicted of economic sabotage and genocide. And the couple were sentenced to death immediately, and both Nicolae and his wife were executed via a firing squad on Christmas Day, 1989. Joseph Stalin. Stalin was born to a poor Georgian family in the Russian Empire, and as a young adult joined the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party, while at the same time he was also helping raise funds for Vladimir Lenin's Bolshevik faction, and how he was donating to this faction was actually by committing bank robberies and other crimes, as well as editing the party's newspaper. Already off to a good start. Because of his crimes, he was repeatedly arrested, where he was exiled to Serbia multiple times. After the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, Stalin served as a member of the Political Bureau of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Very quick and easy name. And from 1922 onward, he used his position as General Secretary to gain control over the entire party. After Vladimir Lenin died in 1924, Stalin was the new man in charge. And Stalin's doctrine of socialism in one country became central to the party's ideology. And while he was now in power and had grand plans for the Soviet Union, it didn't really work out in his favor, because due to his poor policies, natural disasters, increased demand for food because of urbanization caused by his poor policy, a nationwide famine took place from 1932 till 1933 and killed millions of people in the Soviet Union. But that's not all. Only 3 years later, between 1936 and 1938, Stalin executed hundreds of thousands of confirmed and potential political opponents in what was called the Great Purge. And on top of that, under his regime, an estimated 18 million people were processed through the Gulag system of forced labor camps, which was essentially hell on earth. Keep in mind, all of this took place after after World War I and before World War II. Of course, then World War II happens, which is an entirely separate can of worms, which is beyond the scope of this video at this point. But to put it in short, after World War II, the dust had settled and people were happy that, you know, the Axis powers were defeated, but there was still one issue. Western countries wanted capitalism, and the Soviet Union did not, which obviously eventually led to the Cold War, but during this time led to a lot of unease surrounding how things were going to be rebuilt post-World War II. One thing that the Soviet Union decided to do was to build their own nuclear bomb, which they tested in 1949. But unfortunately, during the same year, the country was also experiencing another famine. And on top of that, they also had a state-enforced campaign that killed both Jewish people and intelligent people called the Doctor's Plot. But here's the thing, despite all of the things I mentioned, specifically within the Soviet Union, Stalin was seen in a relatively positive light. He had a cult of personality, he led the Marxist-Leninist movement, and by his followers, he seemed to be the champion of socialism and the man of the working class, although millions of them died. Regardless, at the time, Stalin was relatively popular, and even to this day, in post-Soviet countries, there are old people that still remember times before the Soviet Union fell, where they look at those times fondly, and they miss those times, and they wish that the Soviet Union was reestablished, which is unfortunate because a lot of the countries that are now post-Soviet are riddled with corruption, not allowing them to actually prosper in a capitalistic society. But that's completely beyond the scope of this video. Joseph Stalin died at the age of 74 on March 5th, 1953. He passed away in his personal residence after suffering a stroke. But even though he was now dead, mass murders caused by him didn't stop. What I mean is, following Stalin's death, there was massive funeral celebrations that took place. Like I mentioned, he was relatively popular within the Soviet Union. And because of this, hundreds of thousands of people attended his multi-day funeral. And unfortunately, because of people being so excited or simply so cramped and a lack of fire regulation, at least 109 people were confirmed to have been killed in a crowd crush that took place at the funerals. And it's estimated that it's completely possible that over 1,000 people in total died because of the funeral services that took place. This is one of the more interesting situations we've talked about so far, because at this point, no other dictator was still fully in control and still relatively popular at the time of their death. Up until Stalin, every other dictator either had to go into hiding to die peacefully or was executed. So this one was interesting. What else is interesting is the fact that I post videos every week. Feel free to subscribe. Let's move on. Saddam Hussein. We actually already discussed Saddam Hussein 2 videos ago in our video about bad people that did good things, but in this video, we're not going to discuss any of his good deeds at all. As an adolescent, Saddam attended a nationalistic high school in Baghdad, and after high school, Saddam studied at an Iraqi law school for 3 years when he dropped out in 1957. At that point, he joined the Pan-Arab Ba'ath Party, basically the Iraqi regional branch of the Arab Socialist Party. Interestingly, during his rise to power, Saddam was actually involved in an assassination conspiracy to kill Qasim al-Rashid, who opposed the notion of Pan-Arabism. Although during the assassination attempt, Saddam, who was supposed to provide cover to the other shooters, actually began shooting first, which ended up disorganizing the entire operation, and the person they were trying to assassinate was only hit in the arm and survived. Interestingly, although this assassination attempt was failed, the party that Saddam was a part of, which only had less than 1,000 members, was now gaining widespread coverage and attention because of the attempt. But interestingly, this wasn't necessarily bad publicity. It didn't stop his future political career at all. And he spent the following years in jail, conniving with other small political groups, theorizing other assassination attempts, and ultimately participating in coups. Which brings us to the late 1960s and early 1970s, when Saddam has built himself a reputation of being a progressive and effective politician. And because of this, he found himself becoming the vice president. And he was vice president during the 1973 energy crisis that saw oil prices skyrocketing, which directly benefited Iraq because they were, of course, selling that oil. And with this extra revenue, they were able to help revitalize and strengthen Iraq, pulling people out of poverty and developing and industrializing the country. But of course, his time as vice president and as president is not without its many, many flaws. For example, the use of mustard gas and nerve gas on innocent civilians, which resulted in thousands and thousands of deaths. The Dujal massacre, which took place in 1982 under his rule, which resulted in the execution of 148 men and boys. And on top of both of these things, just general blatant disregard for international law and numerous violations of international borders, some of which were actually subsidized by other countries because Iraq was dealing with the Iranians and Kuwait. Some countries kind of overlooked the war crimes of chemical warfare to help support Iraq because they were fighting with Iran. And by countries that were supporting this, I mean the United States and the United Kingdom. Throughout the entirety of his rule, the divide in Iraq was massive. Some people seeing him as a hero and a great leader, others seeing him as a horrible dictator, and it really all depended on what tribe you belonged to. But in March of 2003, the US invaded Iraq, ending his nearly 24-year regime, which was at this point internationally known for repression, brutal purges, and massive violence used to maintain absolute power. just classic dictator stuff. And during this US invasion in the fall of Baghdad in 2003, Saddam Hussein went into hiding, but he was caught only a few months later when US forces found an underground bunker. After Saddam was captured, he was held in the States and then transferred back to Iraq, where he was put on trial for a lot of the crimes he committed as president, specifically the attack I mentioned in 1982. This trial ended on November 5th, 2006, and Saddam was found guilty and was sentenced to death by hanging. And interestingly, this hanging took place during the Islamic holiday of Eid, which is odd because we also discussed an execution that happened earlier that took place on Christmas. I'm not sure if that's just how the dates lined up or if that was intentional, but regardless, it happened. And a video was actually taken of the execution by somebody who recorded it on their cell phone. And this video was leaked and widespread online and on the news. And as I mentioned, depending on who you were, this execution was seen as justice finally being served or a massive injustice, all depending on what you believed and which tribe you belonged to. Interestingly, Saddam actually requested and tried hard to be executed via firing squad, but in court, that request was denied, and he was obviously hung. Adolf Hitler. Once again, and for the last time, we are back in World War II. Likely one of the most notorious people to come out of the entire World War. The rise of Hitler is likely one of the most well-known and well-talked about of all of the people on this list. So for that reason, I'll keep it brief. Interestingly, unlike basically everybody we've talked about in this video, Hitler was not born in the country that he ended up ruling. Hitler was born in Austria, not Germany. Although being born and living very close to the German border, he felt a very strong sense of German patriotism. And also, interestingly, unlike almost everybody else in this list, Hitler wasn't instantly indoctrinated into politics as a young person. He actually spent his childhood and young adulthood in the arts, not in politics. As an 8-year-old child, he took singing lessons and attended a choir, and at that point even considered becoming a priest. Just imagine if Hitler ended up becoming a priest. That's an insane thought. At the age of 18, Hitler was on his own and flat broke, unable to get into the School of Arts or Architecture because he did not have the secondary school credentials. And this is where we hear that, oh, if only he got accepted into art school. He was not accepted into a university for arts and architecture. And that's where things began to change. Because at the same time, in 1914, when he was rejected from school, the First World War broke out. Hitler enlisted, even though he was an Austrian citizen, he was able to fight with German forces, likely by accident, and following an injury that took place in the war, he returned home from the war in 1917. I can only assume that the hard upbringing that Hitler had combined with the war, Hitler described his role in World War I as the greatest of all experiences. And I can only assume that this is really the first time he felt a sense of purpose in his relatively tumultuous life so far. And I don't think it would be inaccurate to say that this, in the following years, would really spark what Hitler would end up becoming. After World War I was over, Hitler was looking for job opportunities and was actually appointed as an intelligence agent to influence and infiltrate the German Workers' Party. This was Hitler's official introduction into politics. And it only took from 1919 to 1933 for Hitler to rise through the ranks and go from a newly appointed intelligence agent to becoming the official dictator with a totalitarian regime within Germany. Throughout this totalitarian control from 1933 to 1945, Hitler committed more war crimes and human rights violations than you could possibly imagine, with the most notable of which being the Holocaust. But in 1945, his reign of terror and genocide was coming to a close, which brings us to late April 1945 in a bunker in Berlin. Hitler got word that Soviet troops were not only approaching Berlin quickly, but surrounding Berlin, and he had no other option than to go underground. While underground, he still tried to command what he could, although it was obvious that his people were no longer listening. And some of his most high-ranking officials behind his back were trying to negotiate a surrender, when all Hitler wanted was people to fight to the very death. He wanted no expense spared when it came to trying to get out of the situation, even though at this point, he knew it was hopeless. Hitler had gotten word that the Soviets had entered Berlin and that there was absolutely no chance of him surviving. He decided, like the egomaniac that he was, that he wouldn't let anybody else take him out or even imprison him or anything of the sort. So while in the bunker with his brand new bride that he also married in the bunker, Hitler used a pew-pew to scratch his head. And I do apologize for the censorship, but I really have bills to pay. Following Hitler doing that, his wife, Eva Braun, took a pill that made her not feel so good, and the two were no longer around. But it doesn't end there, because following Hitler's instructions, Hitler didn't even want his dead body to be captured by the Soviets. So following his orders, some of Hitler's helpers collected his and Eva's bodies and burned them and then hid the ashes. Although the burned remains were eventually found by the Soviets, and dental records did confirm that these burnt remains belonged to Hitler. And it was then where the hellish, nightmarish Nazi regime was officially concluded. Every banned torture method explained.
Hello everybody at Trust Me Bro. I'm John Kiriakou, the CIA torture whistleblower.
Torture is undoubtedly one of humanity's oldest and darkest pastimes. And interestingly, torture literally predates recorded history itself. Almost every civilization in almost every time period has used torture in some way, shape, or form. Although the methods of this torture and reasons for this torture vary dramatically. And it wasn't until extremely recently that torture was outright banned globally. Which brings us to the point of today's video. Although torture in the modern day is outright banned, the specifics of that ban, as well as the effectiveness of that ban, are debatable. Which is why in this video, I'm going to discuss every banned and illegal torture method, starting by discussing the ancient origins of torture, and then mentioning a few notable examples in history where torture was legal but regulated, and finishing with a laser focus on every banned and illegal torture method in the modern day, as well as a few notable breaches of this modern day torture ban. Because unsurprisingly, some countries like to try to bend the rules or downright ignore the rules altogether. Let's begin. Torture's ancient origins. The ancient origins of torture come in two primary forms: physical evidence and recorded evidence. Let's focus on the first. Currently, the oldest physical evidence we have of humans torturing each other date all the way back to 5200 BC, roughly 7,000 years ago. This physical evidence comes in the form of a Neolithic mass grave. This mass grave was discovered in 2006 when archaeologists were called to a site after construction workers building a road reported finding human bones in a ditch they were digging beside the road. After doing some research, these archaeologists were able to determine that these bodies were over 7,000 years old, and these bodies likely belonged to a group of early farmers that lived in the area. Interestingly and morbidly, in this 7-meter-long pit that was excavated by archaeologists, they were able to find the skeletons of over 26 individuals. However, the assortment of these skeletons was odd, and the conditions of these skeletons were even more odd. For starters, seemingly most of the bodies that were buried in this pit suffered substantial and peculiar damage. Many of these skeletons not only displayed fractured skulls, arrow injuries, and signs of blunt force trauma, they also showed the deliberate destruction and mutilation of the leg bones, something that archaeologists saw as extremely odd. When you couple this fact with the fact that these skeletons did not just belong to adult men, but they also belonged to men, women, and children, meaning that these weren't soldiers, these were simply civilians and farmers, it becomes obvious that these injuries weren't consistent with normal death, and the conclusion that archaeologists and researchers came to was these individuals were the victims of a deliberate torture. Now, whether or not these individuals were tortured while they were alive, or they simply had their bodies mutilated after they died, is debated. Although most researchers and archaeologists working on this project do generally agree that the way that these bodies were scattered in the mass grave, the condition that they were left in, and also the makeup of the individuals in this group are not consistent with any other sort of outcome other than an intentional and methodical destruction and torture of these individuals, shining a rather dark light on the final moments of these individuals as well as the time frame as a whole. This is in no way, shape, or form the first time a human has ever tortured another human, although this is simply the oldest recorded physical evidence of torture we've found so far. And while the experience these individuals likely suffered is beyond brutal, the fact their bodies are able to tell the story of their death nearly 7,000 years later is rather interesting, albeit in a rather morbid and upsetting way. But moving on from the first physical evidence of torture, let's now discuss the first recorded evidence of torture, which comes much later in history, roughly 3,000 years later, or roughly 4,000 years ago from today, in the mid to late 1770s BC. During this time, the ancient city of Babylon was thriving in ancient Mesopotamia. And while there's plenty of things we could talk about in regards to the ancient Babylonians, one of the most relevant parts of their lore I want to discuss is their exceptional record keeping. Most notably, a legal text known as the Code of Hammurabi. The Code of Hammurabi is far from the first ever written record, and it actually came thousands of years after the ancient Sumerians invented the written word and record keeping as an activity. However, the Code of Hammurabi would introduce a first of its own, as it was the first ever piece of recorded text that would mention torture by name, and it did so in a legal context. The Code of Hammurabi mentions countless laws. However, the one most relevant to this video is law number 153, and this law states explicitly, quote, "If a woman bring about the death of her husband for the sake of another man, they shall impale both of them." Now, in case that wasn't already obvious enough, what that's essentially saying is that if a woman is cheating on her husband and decides to conspire with her new boyfriend to kill her husband, both the wife and the boyfriend should be impaled for their crime. Now, while that alone is interesting enough, obviously the most interesting part is that the punishment mentioned by name was being impaled. And while yes, you could argue that being impaled is a method of execution, when you have an execution method that is so painful, so drawn out, and typically done in a public fashion to humiliate the victim as they die, I think it's hard to argue that execution doesn't also serve as a torture method. And therefore, the Code of Hammurabi made history by being the first ever recorded reference of torture. And yet, we're just getting started. Early torture regulations. Although we're about to discuss a small handful of civilizations where torture was relatively common, almost paradoxically, torture had its own code of ethics, or at least rules of conduct. Which to me kind of suggests, even though on a societal level, torture may have been used for one reason or another, on a personal level, it appears that most people knew that torture was something that was objectively bad, at least when used out of context. Which brings us to this entire section. Now, quickly, it's worth mentioning that in these early examples of torture regulation, there aren't many cases where a specific torture method is outright banned. But don't worry, we're getting there. What we do see in these early cases of torture regulation is the outright ban of the use of torture in certain contexts and on certain groups of people. And of course, these early regulations and laws turn into what will eventually become the banning of specific torture methods and eventually the outright ban of torture altogether, which is why it's worth mentioning this brief history, albeit quickly. Let's pick up exactly where we left off in ancient Babylon. Like I just mentioned in the previous section, the Code of Hammurabi, the legal code of Babylon, has the first ever recorded mention of torture, which is interesting, but it's also not that cut and dry. You see, the Code of Hammurabi suggests that Babylonian culture was simply not using torture for no apparent reason. It instead suggested that these torture methods be regulated under the guide of an eye for an eye, essentially meaning the severity of your crime should match the severity of your punishment. Which lines up exactly with the example I gave earlier, where a wife and her secret boyfriend end up killing her husband. They will both suffer torture and death because they caused death on her husband. And whether or not that is moral or just is up to you to decide. However, that's how it was done at the time. And the ancient Babylonians and the Code of Hammurabi, if nothing else, prove that torture was common and literally used to enforce the law. It was also regulated to only be a punishment, and a fitting punishment at that. Now, whether or not these guidelines were followed even a little, if at all, is another story. However, if nothing else, there was at least a written suggestion on how torture should be used. Skipping ahead over 1,000 years from ancient Babylon to ancient Greece, we have an entirely new set of rules surrounding torture. And even though we have over 1,000 years of societal and human development and progress, it almost seems like the rules around torture took one or numerous steps backwards. In ancient Greece, there was no formal ban of torture. However, there was a general exemption of torture for all civilians. However, it's important to understand who is and isn't a civilian in ancient Greece. Civilian doesn't just mean non-member of the military. It also means non-slave and non-foreigner. And both of those groups of people weren't necessarily uncommon in ancient Greece, meaning that torture also wasn't uncommon. But it gets worse. In ancient Babylon, it was at least suggested that torture only be used as a punishment for a crime, and that the severity of the punishment be equal to the severity of the crime. However, in ancient Greece, while torture could be used as a punishment, it was also more commonly used as a method of collecting testimony. And the reason for this is because in ancient Greece, if there was an ongoing legal situation and a slave had evidence that could be helpful in this legal situation, a slave could not simply offer evidence, as slave evidence was often only admissible under duress. Which, to put in simple terms, essentially means evidence from slaves was simply not to be trusted unless the information was offered during torture. So if you were a slave in ancient Greece and you saw somebody kill somebody and you wanted to go report that to whoever, your word essentially meant nothing. And even if you went to go tell them the truth, they couldn't take that at face value, and they would have to beat you and torture you until you would then say the same thing for it to then be trusted and believed. Talk about brutal. And in ancient Rome, they had a similar yet different code of conduct when it came to torture as well. For starters, Roman citizens, just like Greek citizens, were typically exempt from torture. However, in ancient Rome, there was some exceptions where if you were charged with treason, then you would essentially lose your right to not being tortured. On top of that, just like ancient Greece, in ancient Rome, slaves were also routinely tortured both for punishments and testimonies. And on top of just slaves being tortured, free people that were just poor were also tortured simply for having a lower economic and social status. But as brutal as it is, Roman law did eventually progress to be a little bit more just, at least partly. In later Roman history, under the rule of certain rulers, like Augustus for example, there was laws in place that did require prior evidence to be shown before torture could be used in certain legal cases, which was at least a step in the right direction. However, what the requirements for this prior evidence were and how harshly it was scrutinized are debatable. Regardless, it was at least some sort of progress. Which leads us to our final example of ancient torture regulations. Emperor Ashoka was the ruler of the Mauryan Empire in 3rd century BC India. In India at the time, just like every other civilization, torture was common and served its purpose in society. However, interestingly, Emperor Ashoka started to see torture's role in society differently after converting to Buddhism. It's been reported that after Emperor Ashoka became a Buddhist, he began promoting something known as Dhamma, or moral law, a concept that is foundational in many Eastern religions, most notably Buddhism. With this new promotion of moral law, Emperor Ashoka would urge his officials to avoid unjust punishments, or even torture altogether, emphasizing a legal approach of mercy, nonviolence, and humane treatment of individuals. It may have took nearly 2,000 years, but we finally found another civilization that would not only offer an eye for an eye, but also notice that two wrongs don't make a right. Although, once again, this wasn't an outright formal ban or a rule that was hardly followed. In the Mauryan Empire, there was still plenty of torture used, however, progress was being made. And I did want to highlight these examples of torture regulation through history as they do show glimmers of what would later become the progression of human society. And with that, new moral values and new laws, which we can finally discuss. Modern torture bans. Now I know up until now I haven't mentioned any specific methods of torture that have been banned. All we've been able to discuss so far is ways in which torture usage was banned, which is at least a start. But with modern torture bans, we're able to really see an acceleration of the banning of torture methods, and interestingly, the approach is more or less 0 to 100. In every civilization and time period we've discussed, essentially all forms of torture were at least somewhat viable by the government, at least in some context. However, something we see in modern times is not just the ban for certain torture methods, but the ban for torture as a whole. One of the earliest notable advocates for the banning of torture across all of Europe is a man named Cesare Beccaria. He was an Italian philosopher and criminologist, and he was very vocal about his beliefs in torture being ineffective, unjust, and downright barbaric. And while he personally had no political power and wasn't able to enact legislative change himself, his views and opinions quickly spread across both European and American colonies, truly causing individuals to question whether or not torture had a place in modern-day society. And unsurprisingly, what followed the popularity of this thought process was a wave of torture abolitions across most and eventually all of Europe. Sweden, Austria, France, and England were some of the first to ban judicial torture. However, by the late 1800s, almost every country in Europe had an official judicial torture ban in place. Now this is where things get interesting, because seemingly the usage and subsequent banning of judicial torture was more or less of a 0 to 100 approach. It really kind of went, torture was being used, and now it's not. And the torture methods that were being used were more or less of a side note because, well, they were banned now, at least ideally. But that doesn't mean there's not banned methods we can discuss. Just bear with me. You see, following the huge torture ban wave across Europe in the 1800s, we find Europe and the rest of the world experience World War I and then World War II. And following World War II, we see the UN adopting something known as the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And this declaration was officially adopted on December 10th, 1948. And what this declaration was essentially the first global recognition and statement of fundamental human rights globally. This declaration is much longer and much more complex than I could get into in this video. However, one relevant part of this declaration is Article 5, which states, quote, "No one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment," making an extremely cut and dry case on what is and isn't allowed in regards to torture. And obviously, nothing is. Article 5 of this declaration essentially stated there is not any situation where torture is ever permitted, not in wars, not in certain emergencies, and not even in national security situations. Something that we could see as subtle foreshadowing. Now, even though this initial declaration was not legally binding in 1948, it still carried a massive moral and legal influence as it was a globally recognized treaty. However, it wouldn't be long until 1984 that the UN's Convention Against Torture would officially become legally binding, more or less making torture in any place, in any context, of any sort, officially banned globally. something that most would consider a huge W for humanity and society as a whole. But now this is where things get interesting, because even though technically there has been a global ban on torture since 1948, at least according to the UN, I'm sure many of you watching right now are putting the puzzle pieces together in your head that a lot of the torture exposed by the US government took place far after the torture bans. And while, as I mentioned, historically, torture bans have either been all torture is legal or all torture is illegal, I figured a fun way that we could highlight some specific banned torture methods would be by showcasing some of the torture methods that the United States government got exposed for using either many years or many decades after the multiple global torture bans. One of the earliest and most notable examples of torture conducted by the American government basically right after the ban was Project MKUltra. For those unfamiliar, MKUltra was essentially a secret mind control program by the CIA whose sole goal was to try to develop both a truth serum and also to see if it was possible to break the mind of an individual to then rebuild them as your own perfect robot. And these would both be beneficial to the United States government for military applications, as dystopian and disturbing as that sounds. During the duration of Project MKUltra, numerous forms of unique torture took place, with a few notable examples being dosing high levels of LSD and other psychoactive drugs to unwilling and unknown participants to simply see what would happen, electroshock therapy, sensory deprivation, prolonged hypnosis, verbal abuse, sexual abuse, and psychological manipulation. I know I'm just giving a vague overview, but we seriously have so much ground to cover. However, if you do want more information on MKUltra, I'll link a video I made below about it. I have a whole section about MKUltra in my video about conspiracy theories that turned out to be true. Regardless, before we move on from Project MKUltra, it's important to note that many of these methods were used for prolonged amounts of time, once again with the sole goal of breaking the mind and psyche of the unwilling and unknowing participant. And while many of the methods used in MKUltra were non-physical, some of them were. However, the results were the same. The minds and mental health of the victims of the CIA's torture in MKUltra were changed forever, and many feel that justice for these injustices were never truly served. Another notable and disturbing instance of torture being illegally used by the US government happened in the Phoenix program during the Vietnam War. The Phoenix program, once again, was the product of the CIA. And the goal of this program was to act as a counterinsurgency effort in southern Vietnam. And while the reported main goal was to destroy Viet Cong infrastructure, what largely ended up happening and what ended up being exposed later in congressional hearings was a lot more disturbing than what was initially released. Some very graphic and very illegal torture methods used during the Phoenix program were the following: intense beatings with whips and hoses, rape and sexual violence, water torture, electric shocks, specifically electric shocks to the genitals of the victim, intentional dog attacks, inserting objects into the ears and brains of certain individuals, and much more. And while those two separate examples of the CIA and US government using extreme force and illegal torture methods is disturbing enough, we're still not done, because we are only now getting into what some would consider the worst of the offenses. You see, due to an event that happened in 2001 in New York that I can't mention because I want to pay my bills, the United States was reasonably very on edge. However, many would consider their response to this feeling of insecurity as so unreasonable, in fact, that the US government would need to rebrand torture so that they wouldn't feel like they were breaking the law. And that's exactly what they did. From 2002 until 2009, the US government knew that they wanted to extract information out of people by any means necessary. But they also knew that torture was frowned upon and illegal. And because they couldn't publicly be saying that they were torturing people, they needed to rebrand it so it sounded okay. And what they came up with was something known as enhanced interrogation techniques. These techniques were more or less unmistakably torture, and that's further bolstered by the fact that these techniques were only used and demonstrated in locations known as CIA black sites. And what these black sites were essentially secret detention centers where the CIA could keep, hold, torture, and kill prisoners and detainees without necessarily being at the immediate scrutiny of, laws. CIA black sites were hidden all across the world. However, the purpose of all of them was the same: gather intelligence by any means necessary. And interestingly, even though the methods that were used were extreme, the results gathered were typically not. Now, what exactly were they doing at these black sites, you may ask? Well, let me give you a list of banned torture methods that were confirmed, or at least highly suspected of being used at these black sites. Waterboarding, which is essentially the act of simulating drowning, or in some case, literally drowning somebody. Sleep deprivation, keeping people up for nearly a week, if not more. Stress positions, essentially keeping a prisoner in a position that is extremely uncomfortable and painful. Cramped confinement, similar to a stress position. You're not necessarily being held in a painful position, you're just simply in a location you cannot get comfortable in. In some cases, insects were also involved to add extra discomfort. In many cases, torture would take place on detainees who were naked for extra embarrassment and humiliation. Sensory deprivation was used, typically by putting a hood over the head of the prisoner and playing extremely loud music on repeat and keeping them in complete darkness to essentially overload or underload their senses. Exposing individuals to extreme temperatures, in most cases consistently exposing a prisoner to an ice bath or simply pouring cold water on them as they are in their cell or potentially in their stress position, restricting food or water, or in some cases simply manipulating the diet of a prisoner where they wouldn't eat or drink through their mouth, they would simply provide hydration and nourishment rectally, and a countless plethora of other brutal torture methods. Every torture method I just discussed took place in the early 2000s, and were the only ones that were a part of a declassified memo from a Senate report, meaning these definitely weren't the only torture methods that were taking place. They were simply the only ones that were declassified and admitted to. It has been reported that many of these torture methods resulted in the death of detainees in these covert black sites. And due to whistleblowers exposing what was going on behind closed doors, in 2009, the Enhanced Interrogation Techniques program was officially disbanded, although I'll leave it up to you to decide if you believe that fully. And in case you wanted a more informed opinion on the matter, I actually got John Kiriakou himself, the ex-CIA whistleblower, to give his 2 cents on whether or not the CIA is still using these enhanced interrogation techniques.
Hello, everybody at Trust Me Bro. I'm John Kiriakou, the CIA torture whistleblower. I've been asked if the CIA continues to use the so-called enhanced interrogation techniques, even though they were formally outlawed with passage of the McCain-Feinstein Amendment in December of 2014. The truthful answer is I don't know if those techniques are still used. I hope not. They are patently illegal, besides being immoral and unethical. But we kind of just have to take the CIA's word for it.
I really appreciate that, John. But I'm curious, in your opinion, what were some of the worst methods that were used during your time in the CIA? And for these specific methods, do you still think they're being used or not?
The worst one, well, there are several that are really bad, but the generally accepted worst enhanced interrogation technique was waterboarding. Waterboarding is most likely not used by the CIA, just like hypothermia is not used, where we used to call it the cold cell, where they strip you naked, they chain you to an eye bolt in the ceiling, and then they chill your cell to 50 degrees Fahrenheit and throw a bucket of ice water on you every hour. We killed people, we murdered people with that technique. That's not used. Sleep deprivation. The CIA killed people with this technique as well, keeping people awake for as many as 12 days. Well, people begin to lose their minds at day 7 with no sleep. They begin to die. Their organs begin to shut down at day 9 with no sleep. 12 days without sleep, you're dead. They don't do that anymore. But then there are things like stress positions, belly slaps, insult slaps across the face, shaking. We don't know if those techniques are still used. To the best of our understanding, there are no more secret prisons that the CIA owns and runs around the world. Again, we have to take their word for it. But we do know that terrible things take place at Guantanamo and continue to take place at Guantanamo. But, all we can do is trust that Congress does the right thing and trust that the CIA follows the law and hope for the best. It doesn't make me feel very warm and fuzzy. Thanks for the question. All the best.
Thank you, Mr. Kiriakou, for your time, and now let's wrap up the video. Some individuals claim that the torture committed by the United States government under the Enhanced Interrogation Act was completely justified considering the context of what was going on in the country at the time and what they were responding to. However, others claim what the United States government and CIA did was simply not justified and never is under any context. And while that's a debate for another day, if nothing else shows that wherever humans are, torture is not far away. But in case you were curious about other torture methods that were banned, just understand this. Literally any torture method you can think of is illegal. It doesn't matter where it's done or who it's done to, any form of torture in any context, in any setting, in any place is completely forbidden globally. Although, as we know, that doesn't mean that torture can't or won't happen. But it does mean that for the first time in history, there is at least an organized effort to reduce the amount of torture happening globally, which is a good thing. It only took roughly 7,000 years. Serial killers that are still on the loose. Wow, you guys really loved part 1 to this series. The first video I made about a month ago had literally 1 million views in 2 days and over 2 million views in the first week. Safe to say you guys are interested in serial killers that are on the loose, and unfortunately there is still more to discuss, so buckle up. In case you didn't watch the first part of the series, don't worry, let me get you up to speed. According to the FBI, there could be up to 50 active serial killers on the loose in the United States at any given moment. And I think it's important to make that distinction, because being on the loose and being active are 2 different things, which is why this video is a bit of a double feature. I'm going to start by discussing every serial killer that is currently walking among us, and then I'm going to end the video with not only killers that are on the loose, but killers that are on the loose and active to this very day. But without further ado, let's get to this part 2 of killers that could technically kill you. The Texas killing fields. The year is 1977, and it's a hot Texas night in the middle of July. You are heading back home after an evening of spending time with your friends, when you decide to pull into a gas station and top up your tank and grab a drink. Once you get back to your vehicle, it's not unlocking, and you notice that your keys are on the driver's seat. This was a common mistake that you've made numerous times before. However, they've never had quite the same outcome. Knowing what to do in this situation, you decide to call your boyfriend, and you find the nearest outdoor payphone, which luckily was only a few feet away, on site at the gas station. As you head over to the payphone, you notice a car pulling into the gas station, but it's not pulling into a bay to collect gasoline. It's pulling up right beside you. Before you're even able to take the phone off the hook, you notice the person in this vehicle asking if you need some help. You politely decline, but tell them you appreciate the offer. The man in the truck almost over-enthusiastically insists that it's not an issue. This man tells you to just get into his truck and he'll drive you the few feet back to your car. He'll park his truck and he'll get all the tools out necessary to help you get your keys out of your car. Reluctantly, you accept the help because you know it's late and your boyfriend is a few miles away. Although, as soon as you get into this man's truck, the demeanor changes, and unfortunately, you would never be seen again. Well, that is, at least for 18 years, because it wouldn't be until March of 2016 when your remains would finally be found. The story you just heard is based on the reality of one of the many victims of the Texas killing fields. This story specifically was based on what happened to Kelly Ann Cox, a 20-year-old woman who went missing on July 15th in 1997 at a Conoco gas station and wasn't found until March 15th, 2016, when investigators were brought to her remains. This extremely upsetting and disturbing story I just told was unfortunately not rare for the Texas killing fields. And the series of events that took place in this situation are extremely consistent with almost every murder that took place. Now, if you're a keen listener, obviously the Texas killing fields isn't a person, it's a location. And that's because the Texas killing fields isn't just associated with one serial killer. It's actually associated with numerous serial killers, all of which we'll get into. But first, let's further discuss this area of Texas as a whole. The Texas killing fields is a nickname that was given to an area of land surrounding the I-45 highway, which is located in southeast Houston, Texas. I know we started the first Killers on the Loose video with the I-75 killer, which may seem similar at face value, but understand that the I-75 killer was only one individual and his murders took place all across the country. And the killing fields is rather a stark contrast, because although all of the Texas killing field killings took place near the I-45 highway, the actual area where the bodies were found was extremely compact, specifically being a 25-acre patch of land in League City, Texas. And it's in this patch of land where over 34 bodies have been found since the 1970s. And as I stated previously, it's not only suspected, but confirmed that numerous serial killers have been active in this rather confined area. Now, focusing in on this area for a second, what makes this area so special? Is there something in the water that's just causing these Texas residents to begin killing, or is there more to it? And while it hasn't officially been confirmed, authorities who have been working the case for decades now have more or less come to the conclusion that the Texas killing fields are a perfect place to kill somebody and get away with it, which is a terrifying quote to hear from law enforcement. But to further drive this point home, Amy Mann, who actually directed the Texas killing fields movie in 2011, 2011 said this about the Killing Fields patch of land. Quote, "You could actually see the refineries in the south end of League City. You could see the I-45. But if you yelled, no one would necessarily hear you. And if you ran, you wouldn't necessarily have anywhere to go." And that quote alone kind of highlights how there are two major landmarks in the Killing Fields. However, neither of them are extremely helpful for somebody who is being victimized in between the two. And because of this, if you are somebody who is traveling in this area alone, you are unfortunately vulnerable. And while the Texas Killing Fields may be in a bit of a unique geographical location, this part of Houston isn't the only part of the country that's like this. So part of me feels like there's more to it. But honestly, that's just speculation. Focusing back in on the victims of the Texas Killing Fields, as of right now, at least 34 bodies have been recovered in this 25-acre patch of land. And these murders have been happening as early as the 1970s and as recently as the late 2000s. And if you watched part 1 or watched basically any true crime at all, then you can probably theorize on who was the primary target of the Texas Killing Fields. The victims were, of course, young women, with a majority of these women not being women at all, but literally being children, with some of the victims being girls as young as 12 years old. However, with at least 34 murders taking place in a 25-acre patch of land in a time frame that spans over 50 years, the vast majority of the murders that took place in the Killing Fields are still unsolved to this day. However, that doesn't mean that none have been solved. And I am now going to discuss the unfortunately small number of convictions that have taken place so far. The first conviction involves Clyde Edwin Hedrick. He was investigated for the suspicious death of Ellen Beeson. During this investigation, he admitted that he and her had both gone swimming in a nearby lake after leaving a local bar, and he stated that while they were swimming, she accidentally drowned in the water. But he also claimed that he only hid her body because he was scared of being accused for foul play, which I think we can both instantly see through. But unfortunately, at the time, no cause of death could be ascertained. And because of that, in 1996, already 11 years after the murder took place, Hedrick was convicted of abusing a corpse and was sentenced to only 1 year of jail. Now, if the story only ended there, it would be unfair of me to call that a murder, because legally, he was only tampering with a body, which is, well, already disgusting. But of course, the story does not end there. In 2011, Hedrick's ex-wife approached authorities and said that her ex-husband would frequently make incriminating remarks about Beeson's death. And it was this information, along with a second autopsy of Beeson's body, that resulted in authorities getting an arrest warrant that eventually resulted in charges against Hedrick in 2014. Hedrick was officially convicted of manslaughter and was sentenced to 20 years in prison. However, he was released in 2021 and today walks among us. Everything I've stated so far is a fact, but if we're willing to dive into a bit of speculation, it's been alleged that Hedrick made 2 jailhouse confessions during his time in prison. And according to these confessions, he claimed to have murdered 2 other women without ever being caught, making this conviction that much more unsatisfying. The second pair of confessions associated with the Texas Killing Fields come from 1987, when a 30-year-old man named Robert King called the El Paso police, claiming that a year prior in 1986, him and his friend attacked, assaulted, and murdered a young woman named Shelley Sykes. These men were promptly arrested, and they made a deal with authorities that if they could show the police where the body was, they would avoid life sentences. However, during the investigation, they were unable to uncover the body. And because of this, these 2 men were only convicted of aggravated kidnapping, but still received life sentences in 1998. These 2 men, while obviously monsters, are no longer an issue, because both of these men had died behind bars, one in 2015 and one in 2020. The third conviction involves a man named Kevin Smith. In 1996, a 13-year-old girl named Crystal Baker left her grandmother's house to go use a payphone to call her friend to ask her friend if she could stay over. And during her trip from her grandmother's house to the payphone, she was picked up, assaulted, murdered, and dumped, and her body was only found 2 hours later. However, although her body was only found 2 hours after the incident took place, it would take 16 years for justice to be served. And that's because in 2009, Kevin Smith was arrested on a drug charge in Louisiana. And around that same time, DNA evidence from Baker's dress was also being analyzed. And with both of these investigations taking place at the same time, a connection between the two was made. And in 2012, Smith was found guilty of capital murder, where he is currently spending a life sentence in prison. And the final conviction associated with the Texas Killing Fields involves William Lewis Reese. In May of 1997, Reese was arrested for kidnapping and attempting to murder a 19-year-old girl. During this kidnapping, this woman was fortunately able to escape, and he was found and convicted and sentenced to a 60-year prison term. During his time in prison in 2015, his DNA was linked to another murder that took place in 1997, the same year he kidnapped the victim we just spoke about. After this connection was made and the metaphorical cat was out of the bag, Reese confessed to 4 additional murders and was sentenced to death. On top of all of these 4 convictions that took place, there was also an additional 3 suspects that were very likely involved with some of the murders but were never charged. Now, to bring the Texas killing fields back to the original point of this video, as you can see, with only 4 convictions taking place, with a total of 7 confirmed murders within those 4 convictions, that still leaves 27 unsolved murders that have taken place in the Texas killing fields. Meaning that it is an undeniable fact that there are multiple killers and likely serial killers that are on the loose who have actively participated in the atrocities of the Texas killing fields and were never caught. I know this first section was a bit longer than normal, but this story truly has so much depth, and I wanted to bring some of that to light. The Monster of Florence. The year is 1985. You are an Italian man in your early 20s. The girl that you've been seeing at school has finally agreed to go out with you, and tonight was the big night. It's a warm September's evening, and you go to pick her up at her house, and you plan on taking her to a place that was private and secluded, so both of you could have a conversation and potentially more in peace. After a long but pleasant drive down a dirt road, you get to your destination, and you and your date begin to discuss life, school, career paths, and you both are really hitting it off. Even though this moment has been something you've been dreaming of, something feels off. You know you're alone, but for some reason, you feel like you're being watched. Your date begins to kiss you, but for some reason you just can't seem to put your guard down. But you ultimately give in. Finally submitting to the moment, you find yourself hearing a branch crack, and you quickly look around. Your date tells you it's nothing and pulls your face closer to hers, and you both continue what you were doing. That is, until you hear a knock on the window of your car. Your date screams, and you are in shock. There is a man pointing a .22 caliber pistol directly at you and your date. One of the best days of your life has quickly turned into one of the worst. And before you could even process the situation, you and your date were murdered. The story that I just told is the unfortunate reality of many of the victims of the Monster of Florence. The Monster of Florence was notorious for numerous reasons, but most notably the sheer depravity of his actions and also the interesting victim selection that he had. As I alluded to in the intro story, the Monster of Florence almost exclusively targeted young couples seeking private, intimate moments, which was something that historically was almost never seen before. The murders themselves primarily took place in the province of Florence, Italy, and within those 2 decades, 8 couples were murdered, resulting in a total of 16 victims. As I previously stated, all the victims were couples, and all of them were in rural areas, typically attacked during intimate moments. But on top of this, the methods of murder in every instance and the aftermath was also the exact same and genuinely disturbing. What the Monster of Florence would do in nearly every murder is execute both of the partners typically in their vehicle with a .22 caliber pistol, and then after both of the victims were dead, the killer would then go on to mutilate the female victim with a knife. The final consistencies that took place across almost all of the murders was that the murders took place on Saturdays, typically during a new moon, when the moon was not visible in the sky. For the 2 decades that the Monster of Florence was active, he not only terrorized Italy with his actions, but was also actively taunting law enforcement, similar to situations we've seen with other killers, like the Zodiac Killer. One of the most notable communications that the Monster of Florence had with authorities was when the Monster of Florence literally mailed a letter to the district attorney working the case, and attached to this letter was a plastic bag that contained flesh from the chest of one of the last known female victims. And it was since that communication in 1985 when the Monster of Florence had gone silent. With nearly 20 years of terror and 16 victims, there has to be some information about the murder. And well, there is. But similar to the last case we discussed, the information is spotty at best. And even though convictions have been made, the most popular theory surrounding the entire Monster of Florence situation was that the true killer was never caught and is very likely on the loose to this very day. The most notable conviction was actually overturned 2 years later due to police planting evidence on somebody, and before this individual could have a retrial, he died, and his 2 alleged conspirators were only convicted of 4 of the 8 murders. Admittedly, that summary is a rather large oversimplification of the entire conviction situation. But to spare this section from being as long as the first one, just understand that the only prime suspect that authorities ever had was convicted of 7 of the 8 double murders, only to be appealed 2 years later because it was found out that the police literally planted evidence at his home, and even though this conviction was appealed, this individual died before he could have a retrial, meaning that already there are so many unanswered questions. And as I stated, his 2 alleged co-conspirators were officially convicted of 4 of the 8 double murders, but that still means that there are 4 other double murders that took place with no suspect ever caught and brought to justice. Some people believe that Pajani, the original prime suspect, was actually the Monster of Florence, while others believe that the Monster of Florence was actually not one person but the acts of a murder cult that existed in Florence. And I think one of the most popular beliefs was that the true Monster of Florence was somebody that was not on the radar of authorities at all. They were an elusive shut-in who was skilled and methodical and knew how to stay away from the spotlight. Regardless of which theory you believe, the undeniable consistency among all of them is that the true Monster of Florence was never caught. And although some of these murders date all the way back to 1968, there is still a likely chance that the Monster of Florence, or at least one of the Monsters of Florence, is still on the loose to this very day. The Monster of the Andes. Since we're already discussing monsters from other parts of the world, I figured Pedro Lopez, the Monster of the Andes, would be the perfect next entry for this list. Unintentionally, part 1 of this series was pretty US heavy, so for that reason, I tried to make part 2 a bit more international. But with that being said, let's focus back in on the Monster of the Andes. The Monster of the Andes was the nickname given to Pedro Lopez, a Colombian serial killer with probably one of the most insane stories you've ever heard. Pedro Lopez was born in 1948 and committed his first murder in 1969. Over the course of 1969 to 1980, Pedro Lopez assaulted and killed anywhere from 110 to over 300 victims. Most of his victims, unsurprisingly and disturbingly, were young girls. And he committed these atrocities in Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. Now, stating that these murders took place from 1969 to 1980 is a bit deceptive because although the first murders that Pedro Lopez committed was in 1969, it would be the only murders he would commit until he was released from prison in 1978. And if you're following along, yes, Pedro Lopez's first murders actually took place in jail. In 1969, Pedro Lopez was sentenced to 7 years in prison for stealing a car. And after only 2 days in jail, he was assaulted by 4 men in that prison, and instead of reporting this crime, he decided to kill all 4 of these men with a makeshift knife. These murders were deemed self-defense, but it still added 2 years onto his prison sentence. And it wasn't until 1978 when he was a free man once again and decided to begin killing innocent people. From 1978 to 1980, Pedro himself confirmed that he killed over 100 girls, and these girls were primarily street children that came from indigenous tribes, meaning that they were largely unverifiable. And it was that fact alone that allowed him to get away with such heinous acts for so long. It's insane to just think that somebody was able to kill over 100 people in only a 2-year span. That is on average a murder per week consistently for years. Now, here's the deal. At this point, you might be asking yourself, obviously there's no way that this man is on the loose today if we know who he is, and there is reports of him being in, well, at least the zeitgeist of authorities, but that is unfortunately where things take a turn. You see, early on in Pedro's killing spree, he was active in Peru, and he was actually captured by a Peruvian tribe when he was trying to steal a child. The local tribesmen literally tried to kill Pedro by burying him in sand, pouring syrup on his face, and allowing ants to get at him. But an American missionary convinced the tribe that instead of murdering Pedro, they should allow the American missionary to take him to the police. And reluctantly, they agreed. But unfortunately, this missionary took Pedro to the authorities, and the authorities did not detain Lopez. They simply banned him from the country. And after Pedro was banned from Peru, he continued his killing spree in Ecuador. And it wasn't long until Pedro was once again caught trying to steal a child from a village. But this time, the people were able to detain him until police arrived. And once police arrived, he was this time actually arrested. And during his interrogation, he began to talk. As I stated earlier, during this interrogation, Pedro admitted to killing over 100 girls. But at first, the police simply didn't believe him. That was until Pedro was able to bring the authorities to the remains of 53 of his victims. When at that point, the police obviously believed that they had a true insane monster in their hands. It's even stated that Pedro tried his best to take the innocence of as many children as possible because he said that the same thing happened to him as a boy, which only further shows the depravity of this insane individual. Even though when in police custody, Pedro admitted to the murder of at least 350 girls, during his trial, Pedro was only charged with the murder of 57 and found guilty for the murder of 3, which I have no idea how you can literally say you killed someone, take the police to their bodies, and not be convicted. But regardless, for these 3 murders he was found guilty of, he served a 16-year prison sentence, which was the maximum at the time, which is mind-blowing in my opinion. And from 1980 to 1994, Pedro was obviously in prison. Now, if you're asking yourself, wait, that's not 16 years, that's 14 years. You're right. He was actually let out of jail 2 years early, which only further boggles my mind. And then immediately after his release in 1994, he was committed to a mental hospital where he stayed from 1994 till 1998. Now, in case everything I'd mentioned mentioned was just truly not disturbing and disgusting and upsetting enough, things are about to get a lot worse. Because in 1998, Pedro was officially released from the mental hospital, and as of 1999, Pedro has officially disappeared and has not been spotted anywhere by anyone. And although legally speaking, Pedro did serve his time and was no longer a fugitive, the fact that he's out of prison blows my mind. But the fact that he was let out of prison and was not tracked or followed or anything blows my mind even further. But the reality of the situation is this. Pedro Lopez, a man who self-confessed killed over 350 young girls in a 2-year span, nearly one murder every other day, was only found guilty on 3 counts of murder, and for the last 26 years has been completely off the grid, and his whereabouts are, well, unknown. I don't know about you, but if somebody goes on a mass killing spree of children with the sole goal of taking their innocence, I don't think anything is going to stop them. Which is why it's an undeniable fact that Pedro Lopez is on the loose to this day. But it's also my personal opinion that he's likely active, even though he is currently 77 years old. If you're a big true crime fan, then shady or shoddy police work is definitely not something that you're unaware of. But in my opinion, this case is one of the most egregious examples of just poor legislation, resulting in one of the most disgusting serial killers in modern history to be served the equivalent of a slap on the wrist. And I guess speaking of serial killers that could possibly be active currently, I think this is a good point to transition from killers that are just on the loose to killers that are very likely active right now. Before we move on to this more or less speed round of potentially currently active killers, I did just want to say that there was a lot more entries I wanted to put on this list, but as you saw in the first few sections, I went into way more detail than I initially planned on. Regardless, the point I'm trying to make is that there is a lot more on the loose, uncaught killers that I could discuss. So if you do want a part 3, leave a like on this video or comment part 3 to let me know that you would like me to continue this series. It's not a secret that YouTube does not love this sort of content, but if you guys genuinely want it, I will continue to make it. And if you haven't yet, consider subscribing. We're currently on the road to 2 million subscribers. Let's continue. The Buffalo Bayou Killer. I think that this entry is one that a lot of people have been waiting for, and honestly, I was excited to cover it, so let's just dive right into it. In 2025 alone, over 24 bodies have been discovered in bayous across Houston. Notably, a large number of these bodies have been discovered in the Buffalo Bayou specifically. Now, with so many bodies turning up in mysterious places in mysterious ways, it's not unwise to potentially question whether or not there is foul play at play. And it's this thought process that has led to multiple conspiracy theories and the entire idea of a Buffalo Bayou killer, or rather a greater Houston serial killer that is actively on the loose now. Now, candidly, I'm a bit torn in the situation, primarily because there is such little information and this is all so fresh. Like I said in the first video, serial killing investigations are typically long, drawn out, and are not solved for decades, which is why I said previously that unsolved serial cases are more or less of a retrospective game, because you need so much time and evidence to truly connect all of the dots in a meaningful way. But with that being said, what do we know about the facts? Well, basically everything I said. 24 bodies were found in bayous across Houston in 2025. People online think that there is a potential serial killer on the loose right now, and that is not necessarily a crazy idea. However, authorities, specifically Houston police, strongly dispute any claims that there are an active serial killer in Houston. The Houston police doubt there is a serial killer simply because there is no typical pattern amongst these cases they've seen. The demographics of the victims vary widely, the causes of death are not consistent whatsoever, with a good number of deaths being associated with drowning and drug toxicity and other non-violent means. And on top of this, the police recognize that there is still information that is not known, mainly because a lot of these deaths are still pending a final classification, basically meaning that the cause of death for these bodies that are found is still undetermined. When it comes to true crime stories, it's not necessarily uncommon to have police write off the possibility of there being a serial killer when the evidence is so overwhelming, but in this case, I think the police kind of have a point. Should they be outright denying the possibility of a serial killer? I don't think so. But at the same time, if all of these deaths were to be the result of a serial killer, this would definitely be a first, as the victims are not really connected in either way. They're young, old, men, women, everything in between. And as the police stated, the causes of death vary. There's no obvious trauma to a lot of these bodies besides drowning. And I guess speaking about information, one of the families of the victims have publicly voiced their frustration with the Houston police specifically, saying that there has been a major lack of transparency and a huge delay in reporting, which to me is a major red flag, not to even accuse the police whatsoever. But there has just been far too many cases I've covered on this channel and that have just happened generally where the police were obviously negligent and unwilling to accept fault, unfortunately to a killer or criminal's benefit. But yeah, I wanted to discuss this one first and kind of get it out of the way because honestly there's no real information and the authorities don't even believe there is a serial killer. It's more or less of an ongoing conspiracy. But because this is all so new and fresh and, well, popular right now, I thought I would at least mention it. And if you have any sort of information or personal experience, feel free to drop it in the comments. Like I said, this is ongoing, so any information or opinions or insights is at least interesting at this stage. The Sleepy Hollow Killer. This entry is definitely less speculative than the Buffalo Bayou Killer we just discussed, although there is not a ton of information available, making it rather short. The Sleepy Hollow Killer refers to a series of serial killings that took place from the 1990s all the way up until 2007. These murders all took place in South Africa, and all of the victims were women, typically sex workers. The Sleepy Hollow murders began happening in the late 1990s, when several women were found assaulted and strangled to death with their own underwear, all within the same city, Pietermaritzburg. All of their bodies were found near the N3 highway, and with all of these shocking similarities, it put the possibility of a serial killer on the police's radar. And it was because of this revelation that in 2001, the authorities actually re-examined some of the victims' bodies to try to find more information. However, that pursuit was rather unfruitful, and for a while, it seemed like the Sleepy Hollow Killer was inactive and the cases had gone cold. That was until another string of murders took place in 2007, nearly a decade after the first group of murders. Between February and October of 2007, the bodies of 3 women were found near the N3 highway once again, and all of these victims had been assaulted and strangled in the same manner as the victims from the late 90s. One glaring and shocking difference from these 3 recent murders compared to the original murders were the fact that these 3 most recent victims were not only assaulted and killed, but also burned after their death. However, even with this one difference, the police still believe that the murderer is likely linked to the original murders that took place. However, now with numerous victims found, multiple crime scenes, and clear consistencies across the 13 to potentially more than 16 murders, there's still to this day absolutely no convictions and barely even any suspects. The only known suspect as of now was a man who was arrested in 2008 for the murder of a woman that was unrelated. Upon further investigation, authorities on the case said that they believe this individual was not related to the Sleepy Hollow Killer, although it is concerning that there's just so many people like this out there, at least seemingly. With that being said, as of now, there has been no more serial killings associated with the Sleepy Hollow Killer. Although, due to the fact that all of these murders happened so recently, and there was even another resurgent a decade after the original murders, I would say there's a pretty likely chance that the Sleepy Hollow Killer is not only on the loose, but also active to this very day. Or at the very least, dormant and planning their next attack. The Manchester Pusher. Diving directly back into the world of speculation, we have another serial killer that may not even be a serial killer, but I thought it was worth mentioning. The Manchester Pusher is a nickname that's been given to a theorized serial killer allegedly responsible for the deaths of numerous people by pushing them into the waterways of Greater Manchester. Similar to the Buffalo Bayou situation, people believe that there is a serial killer on the loose because there are simply too many people dying in the same way for this to be just a coincidence. However, the authorities, in this case the Greater Manchester Police, don't buy it and are actually, instead of trying to investigate the situation, trying to actively dispel this. The Manchester Police have even gone as far as saying that the Manchester Pusher is nothing more than an urban legend or a myth. And whether that is or isn't the case, let me give you the facts. People that believe that there is a Manchester Pusher claim that there almost has to be a person behind all of the drownings because of the sheer alarming number of deaths that have taken place in the Manchester canals since the early 2000s. Between 2008 and 2016 alone, 85 deaths were recorded in the canals, which is an extremely alarming statistic, although it doesn't necessarily instantly mean there's a serial pusher going around. People that are proponents of the Manchester Pusher theory believe that this potential killer intentionally targets intoxicated young individuals that are standing or hanging out near the canal, ideally when they are alone and away from their friends. At this point, when the Manchester Pusher is alone with his victim, all he needs to do is to simply push this intoxicated individual into the water and allow the rest to just look like a drunk person falling in the water and the death seeming accidental. That doesn't necessarily explain any sort of motive, although I don't think it's unrealistic for a serial killer to want to have a way to kill people that seems inconspicuous. Some serial killer experts who have analyzed the facts believe that it's not a serial killer simply because a serial killer wouldn't get their dark satisfaction from simply pushing somebody into the water. They would want to be more involved and in control, and that is believable. Although I don't think it fully neutralizes the possibility that there is just some sick and twisted individual who gains that dark satisfaction from simply watching someone drown. And whether or not they drowned by accident or because they were intentionally pushed, we don't know the facts yet. Although it is important to note that both authorities and experts do believe that this isn't the actions of an intentional serial killer, but rather an unfortunate coincidence that has been exacerbated by the rise of bars opening on the canals. Now, to throw one wrench into the entire situation though, on April 10th of 2018, a 34-year-old cyclist was intentionally pushed into a canal by an unknown assailant. Not only was the cyclist intentionally pushed into the canal, but as the cyclist was trying to get out of the water, this person kept kicking them back into the water until this unknown pusher eventually ran away, which gave the cyclist time to get out of the water and catch their breath, although not enough time to catch the person who attempted to take their life. As far as we know right now, this is the only confirmed case of somebody intentionally mistakenly pushing somebody into the canal for seemingly malicious reasons. But even with this very real situation, the police have gone out of their way to state that there is no evidence to suggest that this has anything to do with the other incidents associated with the Manchester pusher. But once again, that doesn't mean that it's not a possibility. I wanted to put this one last because, like the Buffalo Bayou Killer, it's very speculative and very unconfirmed. But unlike the Buffalo Bayou Killer, this example is a bit more obscure, so hopefully it was still at least interesting. But with that being said, I want to make a really important and serious message. As interesting and educational as these videos are, it's important to note that every single thing I discussed in this video is real. It's not fantasy. These are real cases with real victims, with real people, with real friends and real families with lives that are either destroyed or lost. And because of that, I truly do try my best to be as respectful as possible when discussing these extremely horrific and unfortunate situations. Crazy cults that are still active today. The Church of God with signs following. Have you ever been in a standard run-of-the-mill Christian church and just thought to yourself, wow, this is really missing something? This is missing a lot of venomous snakes. Well, if you have, surprisingly, you wouldn't be the first, and you would also be a perfect candidate for the Church of God with signs following, which in itself is just a strange name. But trust me when I say that the name is the least strange thing about this cult. Members of the Church of God with signs following are either holiness or Pentecostal Christians, which at a glance may seem normal. However, it's the specific rite or ritual that the Church of God with signs following focus on that makes their congregation so odd. To put it bluntly, one of the core elements of the Church of God with signs following is serpent handling. Specifically the belief that if you are a true Christian, you should easily be able to handle a venomous snake or serpent of any variety without suffering any negative consequence. And in case handling the snake is not enough, you should also be able to consume venom from these venomous snakes completely issue-free. And spoiler alert, there was issues. But before we get too into the weeds on incidents, let me give you some history. The religious practice of snake handling goes all the way back to the 2nd century, when the Ophites reportedly handled snakes during their services and also worshipped serpents, and the tradition has also been seen in ancient Egypt. But the tradition of handling snakes for religious purposes didn't appear in the United States until 1910. And this practice is generally associated with the ministry of George Went Hesley, a minister from Tennessee. George was originally a minister at the Church of God. However, in 1922, he resigned, citing troubles at home, and decided to take his ministry on the road. Through the late 1920s and even 1930s, George traveled through the southeast United States, resuming his ministry as a traveling preacher, promoting both God and the specific practice of serpent handling. Now, interestingly, basically every place that George visited to share this practice was extremely receptive to it, which is, at least to me, a bit shocking. Although it is reported that George was extremely charismatic, persuasive, and passionate about the craft. During his time on the road, George visited small towns in Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, Virginia, Ohio, and even Indiana, and it's reported that each small town adopted the serpent test of faith with overwhelming popularity after having a demonstration from George himself. And it's because of this that the greater Appalachian region kind of adopted the practice. And I mean, I guess you've kind of got to be a charismatic guy to convince random people you don't know that the best way to worship God is, of course, by handling snakes and drinking venom. From the 1930s to the 1940s and 50s and beyond, churches that went on to adopt this serpent handling ritual became known broadly as Churches of God with signs following. And while most of these churches had no real connection besides their Pentecostal roots, the practice of snake handling was able to bring them together and have them categorized as the cult we're discussing right now. Now, if you're asking yourself, where does this belief even come from? And what does it have to do with Christianity at all? Well, the answer is the Bible, actually. People who participate in the serpent handling believe it is so important because of the two following quotes. In Luke 10:19, for example, it says, quote, "Behold, I give unto you power to tread on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall by any means hurt you." Interesting, relatively vague, and I think more metaphorical than anything, but there's also another quote that's a bit more direct, and that's Mark 16:17-18. That goes as follows, quote, "And these signs shall follow them that believe. In my name shall they cast out devils, they shall speak with new tongues, they shall take up serpents, and if they drink any deadly thing, it shall not hurt them. They shall lay hands on the sick, and they shall recover." That is a bit more direct. And if you were, laying around in the 1930s and you had a charismatic man show up into your town with snakes and proof from the Bible that handling snakes could make you more godly, or at least prove your godliness, I could see that argument. However, it's definitely not all sunshine and rainbows. And that's because, unsurprisingly and unfortunately, this practice did lead to deaths. Potentially one of the most ironic and notable deaths caused by this practice was the death of George Went Hensley himself, when in July of 1955, he died after receiving a snake bite at a service he was conducting in Florida. Although George passed away because of this tradition, the tradition did not pass away with him. And this practice and larger cult that he was essentially the grandfather of continued to go on for decades and still persists in the modern day. Honestly, I feel like that'd be a really cool video for those, boots on the ground YouTubers that just film videos with people. Like, imagine a video, I spent 24 hours with the snake cult. That would be cool to see, and maybe we'll see it someday. But for now, this is all you got. Now, back to the tragedies. It's been reported that at least 35 people have died between 1936 and 1973 due to the serpent handling practice. And it's also been stated by multiple sources that today there's likely been at least 105 deaths caused by this serpent handling practice associated with the Church of God with science following. Realistically, the beliefs of this church are going to be the least crazy we talk about, because it's honestly just an odd corner of Christianity that, loves snake handling. However, as we've seen, there has definitely been unfortunate tragedies due to this practice. But with that being said, don't touch venomous snakes, and let's move on. Happy science. Admittedly, happy science sounds rather cute and sounds like it could also be part of a kindergarten curriculum. Although, unsurprisingly, the reality of this cult is not cute whatsoever. Happy Science was founded in 1986 in Japan by a man named Ryu Okawa. Ryu was a successful businessman and stock trader who worked internationally. Although as a student and as a working professional, before he even established Happy Science, he knew that he was meant for something more in this life. And he claims this explicitly, stating in one instance, for example, in 1981, 5 years before the establishment of the Happy Science cult, that while working a job, Ryu experienced Buddha enlightenment and came in contact with a divine spirit. This spirit began communicating with him and told him, quote, good news, good news. Ryu felt so compelled by this message that he grabbed a pen and paper, wrote it down, and then began asking the spirit that was contacting him, who are you? And Ryu alleges that the spirit was a spirit known as Niku Shonin, a senior disciple from the Buddhist religion. Following that experience in 1981, Ryu made it his mission and destiny to found a new religion. And that he did. And only years later, Happy Science was founded and things got extremely weird. Ryu was a massive believer in the spirit world. And in the 2-year span from 1985 to 1987 alone, he published 13 books in an effort to prove the existence of that spirit world. And interestingly, the final 2 books that he published came out in 1991, and these books titled The Great Warning of Allah and The Terrifying Revelations of Nostradamus were both #1 bestsellers in Japan, which is concerning for reasons we'll get into. You see, on a surface level, Happy Science claims to be a group that is about peace, love, truth-seeking, self-reliance, and ultimate prosperity and happiness. And their goal is to spread happiness and peace by spreading the word and truth of their religion. But would you be surprised if I told you that the true intentions of Happy Science are much darker, and the beliefs surrounding Happy Science are, well, downright delusional? The core belief of Happy Science is that an ancient deity named El Cantare, who is claimed to be the highest god on earth and the lord of all gods, was originally the ruler of Venus, but came to Earth to establish the human race. And over the course of all of human history, El Cantare has been watching over humanity and has even been reincarnated multiple times to ensure humanity's prosperity. And the most recent incarnation of the highest god of all gods and this ancient spirit from Venus is, of course, well, Ryu Okawa himself, which is why, of course, he's leading Happy Science, because he is the true enlightened one. And he is so enlightened, in fact, that he claims that he speaks to nearly every single god on a daily basis. Not only can he communicate with gods, but he can also communicate with the spirits of dead historical figures. And there's actually a hilarious interview clip of Okawa doing an interview where he is allegedly possessed by the spirit of Margaret Thatcher and speaking from her spirit. Like, just watch this. This is hilarious.
I can't.
Oh.
I'm still alive.
Your ex-Prime Minister,
Prime Minister.
Margaret Thatcher?
I've been Prime Minister. Dennis!
Besides that core belief of the, well, ancient deity from Venus creating all humanity and now being Okawa himself, they also believed in the existence of reincarnation, angels, demons, heaven, hell, and of course, aliens. And while this cult has extremely kooky roots, from its establishment in 1986 to its #1 bestseller books in 1991, the cult was able to grow to over 5.6 million members worldwide. In 1991 is where things really took off, because the Japanese government officially recognized happy science as a religion, giving it a lot more validity. And due to this national recognition, Happy Science took its marketing to the next level, not only releasing ad campaigns, but also creating its own anime to spread its message. But on top of creating animes and running marketing campaigns, Okawa did not stop writing books. And it's believed that today there have been thousands of books written by Okawa, most of which being just transcriptions from his long, drawn-out, well, speeches. And with the combination of all this media being pumped out and the unlikely success of some of this media, Happy Science was gaining a lot of cash flow, allowing them to, of course, further expand their message. And this expansion eventually led to the establishment of their own political party in Japan. That's right, Happy Science was not happy enough being a cult, they also had to create their own political party, known as the Happiness Realization Party. Now, while Happy Science was kind of able to hide under the guise of being a spiritual awakening and a general positivity and happiness and love-sharing group, the political party is really where the cracks started to show. From its establishment on May 23rd, 2009, the HRP, or Happiness Realization Party, expressed some of the following beliefs or policies. The party believed that a nuclear deterrent was absolutely necessary for Japan. They believed that the Nanking Massacre never happened and that Japan never committed any atrocities against China or Korea. The party believed that Japan invading China and Korea could be possible good ideas, and at the very least, they should extremely militarize Japan. And they also had a laser focus on doubling the population of Japan, bringing it to 300 million in the course of only a few decades. These are really only a few tame examples of what the Happiness Realization Party wanted to accomplish with political power. And it really does serve as a stark contrast between the messages of the cult versus the messages of the political party. Because, as I stated, the cult or religion claimed to be all about inclusivity and love and happiness and literally saving the world through enlightening people to happiness and love and realizing your inner peace, or, something like that. That's essentially what they claimed. If you ignore all of the, ancient deity from Venus starting humanity stuff. Regardless, unsurprisingly, this political party was not nearly as popular as Ryu would have wanted. They gained no seats in parliament, and I think largely they were rather obscure and seen as more of a laughingstock. Now, interestingly, both the cult and political party exist to this very day, although in recent years they have been, well, heavily discredited by inside members, specifically the son of Ryu Okawa and the wife of Ryu Okawa, who have both disowned the cult, saying there's not nearly as many members as there are claimed, and basically disowning their father and husband, saying he was crazy, and this entire cult is, well, a crazy cult. But believe it or not, even with all this lunacy, they still had a literal university that they established in Japan that still exists to this very day. And I guess, speaking of this very day, as of the date of recording this video, Happy Science and the Happiness Realization Party are both still active. But interestingly, they are no longer run by Ryu Okawa, simply because he had passed away. On March 2nd, 2023, the reincarnation of a spirit from Venus had passed away, and since then, the management of both Happy Science and the Happiness Realization Party has kind of been a mystery, because while they remain active, there doesn't appear to be any clear, or at least expressed, change of leadership, and we very well could be actively watching the downfall of this crazy religion that, in my opinion, got way more success and notoriety than it probably ever should have. From ancient deities to anime to millions of dollars to thousands of books to far-right extremism, Happy Science kind of has it all, and I truly hope that this small, oversimplified section has given you a small glimpse into the sheer depravity of, well, that religion turned political party. And with that, let's move on. Grace Road. In the last section, we discussed what happens when you mix insane religious ideologies and extreme political policies. But in this section, we're going to discuss what happens when you mix insane religious ideologies, extreme political policies, and fresh produce. I'm not even joking. Grace Road was established in South Korea in 2002 by a woman named Okju Shin. Okju Shin formed the Grace Road Church because she believed that a doomsday event was on the immediate horizon, and it was her duty to do something about it and to begin informing people, so she and her select chosen few could not only save themselves during this doomsday event, but also save as much of the world as they could. Or at least, so they said. Like basically every cult that's ever existed, its origins and beliefs start with fear-mongering, world-ending, doomsday events that require immediate attention from basically anybody they can get their hands on. And while doomsday events can be scary and compelling, so far we've seen that, well, they've never really happened. That being said, that fact does not stop Grace Road from growing within South Korea. And from 2002 until 2014, Ok Jushin's teaching of a world-ending event and doomsday event coming soon was at least convincing enough for 400 people to join the cult. Now, as I stated, a big part of the belief of this, well, church was the fact that they were going to survive this doomsday event and any famine, and one of their plans of doing so was by creating one of the best farms the world has ever seen. And it's even stated on the Grace Road website that, quote, "A missionary for the church was sent around the world to discover a land to survive the famine. And after scouring 60 countries, we settled on Fiji." And it's actually the move that Grace Road took from South Korea to Fiji that is truly a turning point in the story. Because in the early years of this cult in South Korea, they were essentially doing planning, gathering resources, ideas, spreading the message, and getting people. But once they found the right country and had enough people, the execution of this plan was truly evil. And interestingly, not to get too far ahead of ourselves, even though there is literally verifiable, provable video evidence of human rights violations taking place at the hands of the Grace Road cult, they are still operating in Fiji to this day and have some of the most successful businesses stimulating the economy of Fiji, which is why this story gets so insane and genuinely complex. The primary goal of Grace Road moving to Fiji was not to coexist and stimulate the economy. It was a meticulously planned hostile takeover that has been extremely effective. And this is a hostile takeover of both Fijian land, job, and natives, but also of the lives of the members of Grace Road, because it is alleged that as soon as all of the members moved from South Korea to Fiji, all of them had their passports seized to ensure they had nowhere to go. And once these members were essentially stuck on this island, things only got worse and worse. Interestingly, Grace Road didn't enter Fiji as a church. They entered as a business, and the first establishment was Grace Farm. And this farm was the first of many businesses to be established by Grace Road as part of this hostile takeover I mentioned previously. Shortly after the establishment of this farm in 2014, Grace Road established 7 different restaurants in the following year in 2015, ranging from grocery stores, noodle stores, pizza stores, dessert cafes, chicken grills, and beyond just growing produce and selling food to locals, they also established their own construction company on island. And Grace Road was quickly becoming vertically integrated on this island. And while on the outside this would seem like a great foreign investment stimulating the local economy, on the inside it was becoming very obvious that this hostile takeover was not only malicious but devious for both the members of the cult and the locals, who unfortunately didn't know it yet. Now, interestingly, during the same time that Grace Road was becoming established within Fiji, Fiji was more or less under a military dictatorship that was extremely oppressive, or at least that's how it's been described by the people who lived through it. And it was because of this extremely strict and violent government that freedom of speech was extremely suppressed, and any negative talk about Grace Road was quickly shut down, along with any negative talk about the current government in Fiji as well. Unsurprisingly, this oppressive cult and this oppressive government quickly got rather tight with each other, and formed essentially a synergistic relationship. The government of Fiji would invest money into the Grace Road businesses, Grace Road would build businesses that the government of Fiji wanted to see on island, the businesses were succeeding, and ultimately the government was able to see the businesses they couldn't make be formed. And the cult was essentially able to have immunity from the government because of the economic impact they were creating. Now, at this point, you're definitely asking yourself, okay, what were they doing? You've been hinting at it. What's going on behind doors? What exactly was this cult doing? And while the doomsday beliefs of this cult are nothing new, it's the actions that this cult was taking that make it so diabolical. As I mentioned earlier, almost as soon as they landed on island, they took the passports from everybody, essentially securing free labor for years to come. And that's because many members of Grace Road, and later on locals as well, were forced into labor at the consistent threat of physical punishment and torture. And it was quickly becoming obvious to the members who went to Fiji that the Grace Road cult was not necessarily about saving the world or themselves at all. Grace Road was more so about securing cheap labor and trafficking people from their home countries to Fiji to ensure that their greater plan of, well, overthrowing Fiji and making it their own home base possible. Interestingly, violence wasn't something that you were just threatened with in this cult. It was a core attribute. And this was proven in 2018 when footage emerged of members of this cult forcibly slapping each other in an attempt to, quote, beat the devil out of each other. And it was shown that in a documentary that aired in South Korea, many ex-members of this cult detailed disgusting allegations of physical abuse, being overworked, not being paid for work, being imprisoned, detained, beaten, and basically being sold the dream of salvation while living the reality of somebody in a Russian labor camp. Fortunately, the reign of terror created by Grace Road did not continue for very long, as the political climate in Fiji changed and stories got out about what was truly going on behind the scenes and the abuse that was taking place. And because of this, investigations were swiftly enacted in Fiji and in South Korea. Unsurprisingly, these investigations led to the arrest of Okshu Shin and other high-ranking members of the cult. Although the cult is still active to this day and all of these businesses are still operating. Interestingly, in the businesses in Fiji, you can still get pamphlets that are written from Okshu Shin from jail. And these pamphlets only further prove that this woman is willing to stop at nothing to complete her goal. At this point, you almost have to question, is this woman truly just trying to prepare herself and her followers to survive a doomsday event and live in bliss? Or is this woman just a massive grifter using religious fear and physical violence as a means to traffic and control people in an attempt to grow a massive corporate empire to gain leverage and eventual control of small countries and larger countries until she can, well, eventually run the world? But yeah, if you happen to be a tourist in Fiji, you might notice a lot of Grace Road restaurants and grocery stores and dentistry offices and hardware stores, and you might think that, wow, this is just a really cool local chain. But in reality, the entire lore of Grace Road and the cult behind it is just so hard to wrap your head around. And fortunately, right now, justice is starting to be served, although there are still many very real victims of this cult that took pride in the violence it instilled on its members and almost treated physical violence as a certain virtue. This has to be one of the most notable examples of a cult almost successfully taking over a country, and to this day, Grace Road owned businesses are still highly crucial to the economy and, well, livelihood of people in Fiji, making the story that much more complex and truly unfortunate. And what else is unfortunate is the fact that there are so many cults that are still active to this very day. And it was for that reason that it was kind of tough to boil down so many options into one single video. But here's the deal. I love to make videos that you guys want to see. And so if you would like me to cover more cults that are still active today, all you need to do is let me know. Either leave a like or leave a comment below saying part 2, and I'll be sure to get working on that. And I guess if you're part of the 75% of watchers that are currently not subscribed, consider subscribing so you do not miss that part 2. And with that being said, let's get to the final cult on this list: Superior Universal Alignment. Up until this point, the depravity of the cults we've discussed has ranged pretty drastically. However, this last entry is definitely the most disturbing by far, and it's also the most obscure, with a lot of information being pretty tough to find, at least in English. From 1989 to 1993, a mysterious trend started popping up in rural Brazil of young boys going missing only to later be found dead and mutilated, specifically being castrated. And it was with these discoveries that authorities originally thought there was an organ trafficking ring taking place in this small town in Brazil. But what the authorities didn't know is that they weren't dealing with organ traffickers whatsoever. What they were dealing with was an insane cult. The Superior Universal Alignment was born in rural Brazil, allegedly by a woman named Valentina de Andrade, and she, like others on this list, claimed to have received messages from extraterrestrials. But the messages she received from these extraterrestrials were not about love or peace, they were about a doomsday event. But not only was she enlightened to a doomsday event, but she was also enlightened on how she could survive. Although disgustingly, this revelation and the doctrine that, well, spawned from it was truly evil. The doctrine that the Superior Universal Alignment followed was that boys born after 1981 were evil or tainted, and because of this, they needed to be purged from the earth. And it was because of this that Valentina began using her cult members essentially as hitmen to begin murdering young boys. And because of this, as many as 19 boys were victimized, all between the ages of 8 to 13, all with the sole goal of essentially sacrificing these innocent children to an extraterrestrial god to ensure that Valentina and her followers would be seen as true believers and saved by these aliens when the end times would come, which were allegedly very soon. Now, for a bit of context, it's important to mention that the reason that Valentina even had hitmen at the ready was because after this extraterrestrial premonition she had in her mind, she began preaching about the end times locally, and somehow she caught the attention of notable players within her community, specifically businessmen and doctors. And it was with the influence of these businessmen and the skill of these doctors that she was able to carry out some of the most evil acts in the name of, well, cult sacrifice. Personally, I don't understand how you can have a random woman tell you that, hey, yeah, the world's gonna end like in 10 years and we have to kill children in order to have aliens take us on their spaceship to save us. But literally, people fell for that and they began not only following her, but acting out this evil plan on her behalf. Interestingly, it's reported that Valentina claimed that the world was supposed to end in 1989, and when that didn't happen, some people left the cult feeling, well, duped, but others didn't leave the cult and actually became stronger members of the cult because Valentina told them that the reason that the world didn't end yet was because there wasn't enough sacrifices yet to satisfy the extraterrestrials. And while a majority of the cult left in 1989, those who stayed became extremely, well, extreme, which is when the murders truly began to ramp up. Because some of the members in this cult were surprisingly educated doctors, what they would do on this religious killing spree is literally take organs out of the victims they murdered and sell them on the black market in an attempt to continue funding the cult's mission of getting acceptance from aliens. And it was actually the surgical precision of these removed organs that led authorities to these doctors that were linked directly to the superior universal alignment. Although, unfortunately, even with 2 doctors being highly suspected of being involved in these murders, there was not enough evidence to convict them. And they and the rest of the cult were able to continue their reign of terror until 2 boys who were being abducted and actively castrated were able to escape and report to authorities everything that was happening, which led authorities directly to the cult, and the jig, for the most part, was up. And the result of the following investigation was several members of the cult being convicted and sentenced for their crimes. However, interestingly, Valentina, the woman who essentially put all of these people up to this, was reportedly acquitted of her crimes, partly because she was not present at the scene of the crimes when they happened. And with her being acquitted, it's believed by some that there are still remnants of the superior universal alignment being led in rural parts of Brazil by Valentina and potentially others. But unfortunately, I truly don't have any up-to-date information about the court cases or the current state of superior universal alignment. But if nothing else, this cult is just another disgusting example of how people are willing to do almost anything if presented with a charismatic leader and tempted with, well, universal salvation. And to me, it seems scary to believe that some people could truly be tricked to do such disgusting things simply by telling them that, hey, the world's gonna end in a few years, so it doesn't matter anyway. This is for the greater good. And it almost seems like, especially in these last 2 situations, that these cults weren't even religious at all. The religious clothes put on these cults was simply just a red dress to distract the cult members from what was truly going on. A sadistic plan to control or hurt people. And that kind of seems to be the underlying theme with all cults. Somebody has an evil, depraved idea. They use religious ideologies to control people and have them execute those ideas, or be the victim of those ideas. And well, at this point, I don't think I need to tell you that cults are, well, evil. Mythical creatures that turned out to be real. There's an old saying that goes, truth is stranger than fiction. And I would argue in the case of mythical creatures, this rule definitely applies. The concept of mythology and mythical creatures has existed for thousands upon thousands of years. And with such a long and rich history, it was only a matter of time until some of these mythical creatures turned out to not be myths at all. Which is why in today's double feature, I'm going to start the video by discussing mythical creatures that turned out to just be creatures, and then I'm going to discuss creatures that still remain mythical, but are heavily believed to be real. Let's begin. Mountain spirits. Deep within the Indonesian jungle lives a group of people known as the Moni people. The Moni are an indigenous tribe of people from the Central Papua and Western New Guinea regions of Indonesia. They primarily speak their own Moni language, and in total there is roughly 28,000 Moni people. Not much is publicly known or understood about the Moni people or their traditions. However, one piece of their culture that has now become sort of mainstream is the not-so-mythical creature known as the mountain spirits. For countless generations, the Moni people have passed down stories of a mysterious black and white creature that lived in the forest. And this creature was believed to be a spirit, a positive spirit that should be protected. The Moni people themselves even said that this mythical creature walked upright like a small man. And while that may seem interesting, for the longest time there was no evidence to back up the claim of this black and white small man spirit that inhabited this remote part of Indonesia. Which is why, for the longest time, the mountain spirit was considered to be something of myth to foreigners. That was until 1994, when the story of the spiritual mythical creature living deep within the Indonesian jungle came across the desk of a man named Tim Flannery. Tim Flannery was a highly decorated researcher from Australia. And when he heard the stories of the mythical creature, he knew there had to be something more to it than just fairy tales. Which is why he booked a flight and was determined to separate fact from fiction himself. After landing in Indonesia and traveling deep into the jungle to meet the Moni people, he was briefed on their customs and culture, and then was briefed on the mountain spirit. The Moni people informed Tim that the mountain spirit was elusive, being seen only rarely by the locals, and that if it was seen, it was to be respected, as it was believed that this mythical creature was a spiritual entity. Timothy could tell that the Moni people took this seriously because when he asked them if they'd ever tried to hunt this creature, they instantly denied ever trying to hunt, attack, or approach the spirit, as it was something they almost instantly knew they were to protect. However, even with that interesting story and vague description of white and black creature that sometimes walks on two legs, Tim really didn't know what he was getting himself into. That was until he spent multiple days in the Indonesian jungle and didn't come face to face with any sort of mythical creature or spirit, but actually came in direct contact with a creature known as the dingoso. That's right, the mountain spirit is not a spirit at all. It's actually a rather endangered and extremely rare animal that, in my opinion, is actually more interesting than the mountain spirit ever could be. Let me explain. The dingo is a long-tailed marsupial that can only be found in mountain forests on the west side of New Guinea in Indonesia, which means that for the longest time, the Moni people were the only people in the entire world to even be aware of this animal, even if they did consider it to be a spirit, which honestly isn't unfair, because while they considered it spirit, the rest of the world considered it to be folktale and not even real at all. However, the Moni people knew what they saw, and in my opinion, you should always trust the locals. Back to the dingoso though. The dingoso is also a mammal that is roughly shaped like a bear. It lives in trees. It's the size of a Labrador dog, and believe it or not, it is technically a breed of kangaroo, which, if you ask me, is the most interesting and random combination of attributes you could probably imagine. Regardless, after Tim Flannery was able to confirm the existence of this mysterious creature in 1994, the entire suspicion of the mountain spirits just being fairy tale was broken and actually proven to be fact. And while this discovery was shocking news to the rest of the world, to the Moni people, this was simply affirming something they already knew. And fortunately, it didn't break their belief whatsoever. Even after Tim was able to confirm the existence of the dingoso and then later name it and categorize it, they still treated it as a sacred symbol and believed that the dingoso was the physical embodiment of the spirits of their ancestors, which, in my opinion, is pretty wholesome. Interestingly, at least in my opinion, if the Moni people didn't consider the dingoso to be so sacred, it would have likely been hunted, probably into extinction, because of how rare and endangered this animal already is. And if that were to have happened, then realistically, the dingoso would have likely never been discovered by the scientific community and therefore remaining a mythical creature forever. Although we know that wasn't the case, and in 1994, the dingoso was proven to be a real animal and not just a mythical creature. Although it wasn't until 2009 when it was actually filmed for the first time ever after a BBC documentary crew and a local Moni tribesman spent 11 days in the jungle searching just to find one dingoso or mountain spirit. The devil bird. In rural Sri Lanka, there has been a long-told legend of a mythical creature known as the ulama, or the devil bird. The lore behind the devil bird was simple yet terrifying, and it was for those reasons that it quickly became legend. It is said that if you are in a rural part of Sri Lanka at night, potentially near a jungle or forest, then you could be at risk of hearing the blood-curdling, human-like shriek of the devil bird. Now, while you never saw the devil bird, the shriek alone was enough to turn your blood cold and terrify you, leaving most frozen in fear. However, this shriek wasn't only something that would temporarily scare you, as it had a deeper meaning. According to Sri Lankan folklore, the shriek of the devil bird wasn't only terrifying, it was an omen of imminent death. And it was believed that if you were outside at night and had been exposed to or have heard the shriek of the devil bird, you or someone you knew or loved was soon going to die. Just the lore alone around this mythical creature is enough to have you invested, even without any description of what it may or may not look like. And it's for this reason that this story was told and believed so heavily within Sri Lanka for generations and generations. Although, for people that were not local to Sri Lanka, when they were told about the devil bird custom, many people disregarded it as something of just that, legend, something of myth, something that was, well, downright not real or non-existent. That was until non-locals started to hear the shriek for themselves. And because the shriek was so terrifying and so human-like and so unlike anything that they've heard elsewhere before, biologists knew they had to take a closer look at what could possibly be causing this myth. Because it was too long-running to simply be one hoaxer, and it was too unique and terrifying to be something that was already currently known. And it was with that in 2001, after some time searching, experts were able to confirm with a high likelihood that the devil bird or ulama was maybe not as mythical as people once thought, and that it was more likely the spot-bellied eagle owl, a bird that in its own right is definitely terrifying. The spot-bellied eagle owl is a huge bird of prey that literally just looks terrifying, like it looks like a mythical creature. These birds live primarily in the forest and live mainly in India and Southeast Asia. They reportedly weigh around 3 pounds, and most notably, this owl is now famous after its semi-recently discovered human-sounding call. The call that essentially made this eagle owl a mythical creature in the first place. Now, with that being said, I know I can't keep talking about this legendary sound without showing it to you. So I'm gonna play a bit of audio of a recording somebody took of an actual spot-bellied eagle owl. But I did want to give fair warning in case you were superstitious yourself and did believe that this call may actually bring death to you or a loved one. Which, I wouldn't blame you if that were the case, but with that, here's the sound. Sea serpents. I see serpents. Do you see serpents? I'll tell you who saw serpents: sailors. Sailors saw serpents so often that they became legendary mythical creatures. Sea serpents were first reported as massive snake-like creatures that were found in deep, dangerous waters. And in folklore stories of these mythological creatures, they were described as dangerous, ship-attacking monsters. Stories of sea serpents exist in many different cultures and mythologies. For example, Norse mythology, Babylonian mythology, and even Greek mythology. But what if I told you that, once again, this mythical creature was perhaps not so mythical? For thousands of years, different cultures and civilizations described seeing a nearly impossibly long, snake-like creature approaching their boats and even attacking them. It was actually the persistence of these extremely similar stories being told across numerous cultures that actually inspired scientists in the 1700s to try to finally put this myth to bed once and for all. However, in their studies, they didn't find a nothing burger. What they actually found was fish tacos. That was corny, but we're keeping it in. No, but in reality, in 1772, scientists found what they believed to be what everybody was considering sea serpents to be in all of these different mythological accounts. This fish was identified as the oarfish. And the oarfish, similar to some of the other entries on this list, once again just goes to show that fact is sometimes stranger than fiction. The oarfish is an extremely long, ribbon-like fish that is typically only found deep in tropical oceans and is usually rarely ever seen by humans. One subsect of the oarfish, known as the giant oarfish, is the longest bony fish alive and can grow up to 36 feet long. Besides just being rare and massive, oarfish are also extremely unique because they have been sighted swimming vertically, meaning they're not, doing normal fish stuff. They're literally swimming as if they were walking to work. Besides their weird methods of transportation, they also have a rather unique look to them. They have a silvery, scaly body, but they also have a bright red dorsal fin along its back, which definitely makes it stand out against blue water and also gives it a rather mythical appearance to some individuals, further bolstering the theory that this never-before-seen fish was a mythical creature and not your average fish. Which, if you think about it, isn't unreasonable for somebody in the 15 or 1600s or even, earlier than that to see a crazy never-before-seen fish and to assume it's, well, something of myth rather than a never-before-seen fish because of how different it was from most fish we know today, or were even known at the time for that matter. Regardless, even though today it is commonly believed that most sea serpent accounts are simply encounters with oarfish, in the modern day, now that this mythical creature has been more or less demystified, it doesn't mean that there isn't any superstition still surrounding this fish. And what I mean by that is that even today, in 2026, the oarfish is still considered not a sea serpent, but a sign of a doomsday event coming. And I'm not joking. It is commonly believed by some that if you find an oarfish washed up on the beach somewhere, there is a very high chance that there will be a devastating earthquake or tsunami to happen shortly after the discovery of this fish. Now, while calling the oarfish a doomsday fish may seem like just another legendary attribute being associated with an animal that is real and not mythical, that superstition has unfortunately been bolstered in recent years. From 2009 to 2010 in Japan, there was over 20 oarfish sightings that were washed up on the beaches. And in 2011 in Japan, there was a tragic earthquake that ended up killing over 20,000 people, which has led some people to believe that potentially the sightings of the oarfish had something to do with it, or at least predicted the tragedy. Now, regardless of what you believe personally, I think the story of the oarfish is just so interesting, because it started as a fish that was thought to be a sea serpent of legendary proportions, and then it was found out to just be an extremely odd and rare fish, But even then, within its scientific discovery, it took on a whole new meaning as a doomsday fish, which later went on to kind of prove that it may or may not have some mythical properties after all. The black swan. It is reported that in the 1400s, 1500s, and even 1600s in Europe, there was a saying that if you called something a black swan, you were essentially saying that something did not exist. Consider it a post-medieval way of saying when pigs fly. The analogy of a black swan was reportedly rather common, and it, for a long time, was rooted in fact. Across all of Europe, every swan that had ever been seen ever was white, and it was believed for that reason that swans across the globe were only white, because only white swans existed in Europe. Hence the existence and popularity of the black swan analogy. Regardless, up until 1697, according to Europe, swans were white and only white, and a swan of any other color was simply not possible. That was until 1697, when Dutch explorer William de Vlaming arrived in Western Australia on an expedition and just so happened to almost instantly be met with a creature that he and everybody he had ever known considered to be something that truly did not exist. He came face to face with a group of black swans. Obviously shocked, William knew that he had to take some examples home with him to prove he was not crazy, because if he did go home and claim to have seen black swans, he would not only be ridiculed, but potentially even be exiled for suggesting such a crazy thing. And it was with him showing the rest of Europe the existence of the black swan that the entire European mindset was essentially shifted. Initially only about the existence of other types of swans, but the lesson that was taught from this experience was pretty significant. The moral of the story that was kind of taken away from this entire experience down the line was that just because you haven't seen something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And it's actually for that reason exactly that I wanted to add it in this video, because as almost every creature I've discussed has proven, just because you haven't seen it yet doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And the story of the black swan is almost a perfect example, because it wasn't even thought to have existed by anybody. It was literally thought to have never existed, and its mythology was actually in the fact that it could not exist simply because it had never been seen, and it was the opposite of what was seen. To Europe at the time, a black swan was the least likely thing possible, and I'm sure you see the irony. Regardless, the revelation of the existence of the black swan was so significant in fact that it actually coined a new term. Before this event, black swans were an analogy of something that simply could not happen, would not happen, does not exist. But after the discovery of black swans in Europe, the term black swan or black swan event was used to describe an event that was rare, unexpected, and challenged beliefs, or has or had outsized effects on society, which is pretty interesting to think about. The duck-billed bozo. Okay, I'm gonna keep this section short because it's technically not a mythical creature, but I really wanted to talk about it because this story is so funny. As most people probably know by now, platypuses are real, but also insane. And likely the best example of fact is stranger than fiction. And that's because platypuses literally have mythical creature level lore while being an extremely real creature. And platypuses have such mythical creature level lore that when the first platypus bodies were discovered by European naturalists, the Europeans actually believed that these bodies had to be mutilated bodies of an assortment of different animals because of how strange the platypus appeared. Let me set the scene. The year is 1799. A British explorer is in Australia, once again, and finds this weird creature. They don't know what it's called, they don't know what it's all about, but he sends it back to Britain. The naturalists in Britain examine this creature that was sent from Australia, and the conclusion they come to was not that this was some unseen animal, but they actually came to the conclusion that somebody must have tampered with this specimen simply because of how outrageous it was. At the time, the platypus was officially considered a hoax by the scientific community simply because of how weird it was. In case you're unfamiliar with exactly how strange platypuses are, let me fill you in. For starters, platypuses are essentially beavers with duck bills and otter feet, and it was actually that exact combination of animals that these British naturalists thought were put together by somebody on the ship who tampered with the specimen. On top of that, platypuses are mammals, but mammals that lay eggs, which is essentially a contradiction, but we're only getting started. On top of laying eggs, platypuses are also venomous. That's right, they basically have a little toenail or little horn on their fins that they will use to stab their prey with and inject them with venom. And if that wasn't crazy enough, while platypuses are amphibious, when they go underwater, they close their eyes and ears, making them deaf and blind, and it's because of this in water they rely on electromagnetic pulses to hunt, which they do rather effectively. And on top of that, they also outsource teeth. That's right, platypuses don't have teeth, but if they need to chew, they'll put rocks in their mouth so that they can use something to crush their food. Now, you might be asking, if they lay eggs, do they feed their young like birds? And the answer is, of course not. Since platypuses are mammals, they have milk, but they don't have nipples. They feed their young through their armpit milk. That's right, their milk comes out of their armpits. I could go on a lot longer about platypus facts, but I think you guys get the idea. Platypuses are so strange that when they were first discovered, they were considered to be a hoax or something of mythology. And even after describing this very real creature to you now, I'm still not convinced that platypuses aren't some mythical creature that snuck their way into reality. Like, I've made a lot of videos on mythical creatures back in the day. They actually were kind of the cornerstone of my channel. And if you watch those videos, well, you're definitely an OG. But I mention this because I have learned about and talked about plenty of mythical creatures that don't have nearly the cool lore that platypuses do. Which, if nothing else, proves that truth is definitely stranger than fiction. But let's move on. Okay, I want to use this moment to mark the turning point in this video. As I mentioned earlier, this video is going to be a two-parter, basically a double feature. I wanted to start with creatures that were verifiably real, or at least extremely closely linked to real creatures, and scientifically believed to be those creatures. But now I'm going to discuss creatures that are either more loosely connected to real creatures that I didn't want to necessarily say as real because the connection's a bit loose, or creatures that essentially have no basis but are still heavily believed in some cultures. Of course, there was a bunch of other real mythical creatures I wanted to mention at the beginning of this video, but I can only add so many. So if you want to see a part 2 where I talk about more mythical creatures that are provably real, then please leave a like or leave a comment on this video saying part 2. And finally, I wanted to mention a few honorable mentions for the first part of this video. 2 other mythical creatures that turned out to be real are the gorilla and the Haast eagle. And the only reason I didn't mention them in this video was because I actually talked about them in my video last month about myths that turned out to be fact. So if you like this video about mythical creatures that turned out to be true and want to learn about myths that turned out to be fact, after this video, check out that video. I'm going to link it in the description, and I'm also going to pop it on screen at the end of the video. So don't worry about watching it now, but I figured I'd at least mention it because I'm sure some people are going to bring it up. But with that out of the way, let's discuss more mythical creatures with a bit of a looser basis in reality. The chupacabra. Honestly, I was a bit torn on where to put the chupacabra because personally, I think that the explanation for it makes a lot of sense and for that reason could kind of give a real explanation for this mythical creature. But because some descriptions of this creature are so different than the logical explanation, I figured it would be a safe bet to put it in this part of the video. Now, if you're not familiar, the chupacabra is a legendary mythical creature from Latin America specifically, and it's most popular in places like Mexico or Puerto Rico. The name chupacabra itself, it literally means goat sucker, and this mythical creature is referred to as the goat sucker because it almost has been exclusively reported to attack livestock, specifically goats in particular. Now, visual depictions of the chupacabra kind of vary drastically. Some descriptions state that the chupacabra looks like a short, reptilian, alien-looking creature that's a couple feet tall, covered in scales and green, while others say that it kind of looks like a hairless dog with sharp teeth, glowing eyes, and no fur. But regardless of what the mixed visual accounts of the chupacabra look like, the one common denominator among all accounts is its trademark method of murder, which is, of course, to bite the neck of the goat, drain all its blood, and leave it for dead, essentially being vampiric in nature. And it's because of this consistent and strange method of attack, coupled with its strange look, that turned the chupacabra into legendary folklore in Latin America, and now more parts of the world as well. Here's the deal. Some people that live in rural Latin America, whether they own livestock or not, believe in the chupacabra deeply, and for that reason go to extra measures to ensure the safety of their animals, pets, or even themselves. And it's because of this, once again, like we've seen in other sections, that the widespread belief and fear caused scientists to take a closer look at what actually was going on, because they didn't believe there was a mythical creature on the loose, and for that reason, they wanted to get to the bottom of it. And the conclusion they came to after years of research was simple, but in my opinion, likely the case. Many scientists believe that the chupacabra mythical creature is more of a sad situation than a legendary sighting. What they believe is that the chupacabra, in most cases, is a wild dog or even coyote with a disease known as mange. And what mange does, at least in severe cases, is causes the animal's hair to fall out, causes them to be emaciated, and causes them to be extra aggressive. Traits that are almost exclusively associated with chupacabra attacks and sightings. For scientists who believe that to be the case, they deem the story of the Chupacabra legend to kind of highlight how folklore can sort of spawn from real-world events, but through storytelling, exaggeration, and fear of the unknown, grown into something much different, and even in some cases, an entirely new entity of its own, causing a creature in reality to be the artistic inspiration for a creature in mythology. Vampires. Since we were on the topic of blood-sucking mythical creatures, I figured why not talk about the most iconic of all, the vampire. The stories of vampires exist across multiple different cultures, across multiple different eras of history. But most people typically associate vampires with Eastern Europe specifically. Think Transylvania. If I asked you to describe a generic vampire, what would you describe? Tall, skinny man, slicked back black hair, emaciated skinny face, sharp teeth, sunken in eyes, basically looking dead? Interestingly, descriptions of vampires have stayed relatively consistent from the 1800s to today. Although how this mythical folklore creature is treated definitely differs by time period. At the time of the vampire's establishment in the 18th century in Eastern Europe, the story of vampires was treated a lot more like fact than fiction. For good reason too. In countries like Romania and Albania, life was hard, and mysterious disease was prevalent. It was for this reason that individuals were looking for almost any explanation they could find on why people were seemingly dying mysterious deaths. And besides just theorizing on what it could potentially be, they decided to go directly to the source, which included digging up people who have died from these diseases. And what they found was gruesome. Upon digging up the graves of people that have died, they found bodies that they believed to look alive. But not only did they look alive, they looked like they had attacked somebody. Bodies that were dug up from these graves had blood around their mouths. Their body was bloated. It appeared that their hair and fingernails had grown. And it was then assumed that these individuals were not dead at all. They were simply playing dead during the day. But at night, they were becoming undead and causing some of these mysterious deaths. And it was this discovery that triggered a short-lived mass hysteria, which we later adopted into pop culture in the modern day, but I'll get to that later. The result of this mass hysteria depends on the region in which we're talking about, but some of the most common practices involved digging up bodies and chopping off their heads if they looked like they were vampires, burning coffins or burning people as soon as they died to prevent them from becoming vampires, or simply staking down bodies in coffins to prevent them from being able to get up. Now, it should be noted that this hysteria was typically shared among lower classes, and the royalty at the time in the regions were actively trying to disprove the vampire myth so that they could prevent the amount of bodies that were being dug up. And they eventually enacted laws to prevent tampering with graves to prevent more graves from being dug up, as they believed that the whole vampire hysteria was total garbage. Now, at a glance, it might seem interesting how these royals knew anything more than the common people. But then when you realize that, well, the royals were the really only people that had access to any sort of education, including education about biology, it becomes easier to understand how potentially these people could have more context on life and reality than people that are essentially kept in the dark and have to fight every single day to get a morsel of food. Regardless, after the hysteria died down, beliefs about vampires were extinguished for the most part. However, the legend did not die, and stories that were originally used as words of warning were now used for entertainment, and eventually evolved to the vampire stories that we now know and associate with the creature today. Mermaids. For hundreds of years, sailors across the globe from different cultures, from different civilizations, have all told similar stories of beautiful half-woman, half-fish creatures out at sea, either seducing, singing songs, or trying to lure these sailors, typically, to their doom. But what if I told you that the mythical creature of the mermaid may have more basis in reality than you may think? And in my opinion, the explanation that experts have come up with is utterly hilarious. I really don't think I need to explain what a mermaid is, so I'm just gonna kind of get into it. But right now, if you had to guess, what real-world animal do you think inspired the story of the mermaid? If I told you the manatee, would you believe me? Because that is, of course, the case. Now, while at a glance it may seem hilarious to suggest that a manatee could inspire the story of the mermaid, these experts do have some claims that have at least a bit of validity. For starters, manatees are large, typically human-sized, at least from a distance. They live mostly in warm coastal waters, and they are considered by some to have human-like characteristics. For starters, manatees are typically seen standing in shallow water, poking their heads out of the water, which at a distance, either in foggy water or rough water, could look like a person. They also have flippers that contain bones, which they can use in a similar fashion to human hands to try to grab or move objects. And if you weren't really looking, you could say they have a sort of humanoid shape, especially if you're only seeing the bottom of them above water and the top of them underwater. Now, interestingly, if you want a historical account, in 1493, Christopher Columbus himself reported seeing mermaids, but also noted that they were not nearly as beautiful as he expected, which does give more validity to the expert's theory that, well, mermaids were actually likely inspired by manatee sightings. But in my opinion, these sailors would have had to have a lot to drink if they saw manatees and started seeing beautiful women. Like, talk about beer goggles.